release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza so that we create the sustainable conditions for a long-term and enduring ceasefire. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that is what I impressed upon the Israeli Prime Minister last week when I spoke to him.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr Speaker, tonight this House will have the opportunity to join with the majority of the international community and say that enough is enough, that the killing in Gaza must stop and that the hostages must be released. And the best way to do that is to send a clear and united message that we back an immediate ceasefire. Surely all of us, irrespective of our political allegiance, can agree on that very issue.
Mr. Speaker, of course we want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible and never again allow Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks that Israel was subject to. But he talks about the UN resolution, but just calling for an immediate full ceasefire now, which collapses back into fighting within days or weeks, is not in anyone's interest, Mr. Speaker. We must work towards a permanent ceasefire, and that's why the right approach is the approach that we've set out and the United States have set out in their resolution, which is for an immediate humanitarian pause to get hostages out and aid in so that we then can create the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire. And in the meantime, we're doing everything we can to increase the amount of humanitarian aid that we bring into Gaza, something I discussed with the King of Jordan last week, and we will have more updates in the coming days of more airdrops into Gaza, but also just in the last couple of days have managed to deliver family tents into Gaza, which are providing much needed shelter for very vulnerable people.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Key to the much-needed regeneration of Aylesbury are new link roads to cut congestion. Money from the cancelled part of HS2 is meant to be paying towards them. That's only right, given the destruction that's being caused by the construction of the first part of this unwanted railway. But the cash hasn't arrived yet. So can my right honourable friend assure my constituents they will get the roads they need so they can spend less time sitting in traffic jams and more time growing the local economy?
Well, as my honourable friend knows, last autumn we announced the government's vision to redirect £36 billion of savings from HS2 to invest in hundreds of transport projects across the country, including possible increased funding for two projects that I know my honourable friend has campaigned on tirelessly, the South East Aylesbury Link Road and the Aylesbury Eastern Link Road. I know he's met with the relevant minister on a number of occasions to discuss these proposals, and I can tell him that the details of how these funding uplifts will be allocated will be decided very shortly.
Neil Hanbait.
Over 40,000 North Sea oil and gas jobs are at risk from an incoming Labour administration, and neither Labour, the Tories or the SNP have lifted a finger to save Grangemouth oil refinery from closure. With the passing of last night's petroleum bill, the UK government gave not one but two fingers to Scotland's energy ambitions within the UK. In today's money, can the Prime Minister explain? In today's money, the UK has received over £300 billion in tax receipts from North Sea oil and gas. So why can't the UK government find £80 million to secure Grangemouth's future into and profitability beyond 2025?
Mr. Speaker, as I've previously told the House, the future of Grangemouth is a commercial decision for their owners. The site will remain operating as a refinery until at least May 2025. The UK and the Scottish governments are working together to make sure that there are sufficient assurances in place for the support of employees. But when it comes to backing Scottish energy, Mr. Speaker, it's this government that just this week has ensured that we can support British North Sea oil and gas, safeguarding 200,000 jobs and increasing our energy security. It's the SNP and the Labour Party that oppose that, but we will always back our fantastic North Sea economy.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with me and Welsh farmers like Gareth Wyn-Jones that our farmers and food security are vital and that the agricultural budget should be ring-fenced, unlike the Welsh Labour government propped up by Plaid, which is determined to force our farmers out of business with its approach to nitrate vulnerable zones, TB, and its new sustainable farming scheme, which, using Welsh Government's own analysis, is forecast to result in 5,500 job losses and a £200 million hit to the Welsh economy.
My honourable friend is an excellent campaigner on behalf of her local farming community, and I know that she's been working hard with Gareth Wyn-Jones to raise their voice, especially where there is so much concern, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we're supporting farmers with more money to grow more British food, in contrast to the plans that she highlighted, which would decimate farming communities in Wales. It's the opposite of what is needed. While we will always back our rural communities across the UK, it's Labour that would take them back to square one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now over 2 years since the fan-led review on football governance was produced. Will the Prime Minister commit now to setting up an independent regulator with the upfront power to intervene to achieve a fairer distribution of the enormous riches which football has, to ensure that no community in the future loses its football club like happened in Bury? Will he commit to bring legislation forward urgently, or is he going to leave it for a future Labour government to act on behalf of football fans?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the independent regulator will put fans back at the heart of football and help to deliver a sustainable future for all clubs. That delivers on our manifesto commitment, and the government is engaged in discussions with industry, and as was part of our King's speech, as the honourable gentleman knows. But I'm glad he brought up Bury Football Club, because it was the honourable member on this side of the House for Bury who ensured £1 million of funding to safeguard that football club, and that's what we're doing to communities up and down the country, Mr. Speaker.
GP surgeries promised in planning applications take far too long to be built. So can we clear away the obstacles and make it easier for our amazing family doctors to use additional consulting rooms that they're happy with elsewhere in the community, so that GPs and the many extra prescribing nurses they're now employing can see more patients now while they wait for bespoke premises to be built?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, something that he speaks from a point of authority. Now, he knows that we do have high standards to ensure that GPs must provide services from premises that meet all the criteria required, but I do understand that it is possible for those services to be provided at alternative locations that meet the contract requirements. I'll happily ensure that the Health Secretary looks into his suggestions for more flexibility, but I know he will also welcome our recent plans to expand the range of services available at pharmacies, saving many people time and hassle to get treatment for 7 common ailments at their local pharmacists, easing the pressure on our GPs and speeding up the care that people deserve.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, I was in the House on 18th March 2003 when this House voted to go to war on Iraq on the demands of the then Labour government. What followed was death, misery and destruction on an almost unimaginable scale. Voting against the Iraq war was the vote that I'm most proud of in my time in this House. Today, after 29,000 deaths in Gaza, we face a vote of similar significance. Does the Prime Minister believe that MPs today should look back with that same pride, knowing that they have done everything possible to stop the death, destruction and misery tonight?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, nobody wants to see the fighting in Gaza go on for a moment longer than is necessary. Nobody wants to see innocent civilians suffer, and that's why we're doing absolutely everything we can to bring about an immediate humanitarian pause, allowing for the safe release of hostages, which the honourable gentleman failed to mention, I believe, but also getting more aid into Gaza to create the conditions for a genuinely sustainable ceasefire. That is the position that is shared by our allies. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that's what our motion tonight will reflect.
Andrew Rosenberg.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I've had the privilege to be spending a lot of time with the law-abiding, tax-paying, hard-working, patriotic people of Romford in recent months, and they've been telling me what they think. So, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with the people of Romford that we need a radical plan to control immigration and stop illegal immigration, that we need to regain sovereignty over our human rights laws in this country, that we need to tell the Mayor of London we need more police to stop crime in the London Borough of Havering. We need a fair funding settlement for Havering. So will he come with me to Romford Market, follow the footsteps of Margaret Thatcher, meet the people of Romford, because the one thing I can tell him they don't want is to be taken back into the European Union by a socialist government.
Can I welcome my honourable friend? Can I welcome my honourable friend back to his place? Can I say I agree with everything he said, and I look forward to visiting him and his Romford constituents at the earliest opportunity.
Western.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a recent meeting of Warwickshire County Council, children with special educational needs were described by some county councillors as requiring, and I quote, some form of strict correction, or were, and I quote, just really badly behaved kids. Other inappropriate language was used. Parents of SEND children across the country have been outraged by this. 30,000 of them have signed a petition calling for those councillors' resignation. Will he condemn the Conservative councillors' language and urge them to do the right thing and resign?
Mr. Speaker, I haven't seen the details of those comments on this issue, but more generally, the government does have a strong track record of supporting those with disabilities. It's important that children with special educational needs do receive the right support in the right place at the right time. We've seen increased funding for SEN by 60% over this Parliament to over £10 billion, and most recently the Education and Health Departments are piloting a new project to improve access to specialty support in mainstream primary schools, because we want to make sure that these children get all the support and opportunities that they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, we've legislated to give the public ID verification options on social media. Tech companies know the safety value and popularity of this because they offer it now, but for a big fee every month, and it's not good enough. Bereaved parents are campaigning for more measures to protect kids online. Fraudsters are routinely exploiting fake social media accounts to scam, and fears of global political interference in elections from faceless, traceless bots are creating the perfect cyber storm. Will my right honourable friend use his influence to get tech companies to get on with offering robust, visible and free verification measures as soon as possible to keep people safe?
Can I start by commending my honourable friend for her work on this issue? And she's absolutely right that user verification can be a powerful tool to keep people safe online. The Online Safety Act, as she knows, requires companies to offer all adults optional user identity verification. Companies will also need to take firm action to improve safety for children in particular, and Ofcom will be able to monitor tech companies and have strong powers to ensure they comply. But I can tell her that the Home Secretary is meeting with the industry on Monday next week and will be sure to raise the points that she has mentioned today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A KPMG study finds a strong economic case to remove power cables over the time. And despite my questions to previous Prime Ministers, we are no further forward. Can this Prime Minister finally secure a commitment from National Grid to implement its clear legal obligation and fund this vital work? This fog on the Tyne is impeding local businesses and risks possible net GVA benefits of up to £1.2 billion. Our Great River needs action now.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to look into the issue that the Honourable Lady raised, but what would be damaging to the North East and the Tyne are her party's plans to stick with their completely ridiculous 2030 decarbonisation target with absolutely no plan to pay for it, which just means higher taxes for everyone in her constituency and the country.
John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain's food security, compromised by cheap foreign imports, now faces a parallel threat. All kinds of industrialisation in the countryside, from large solar plants to interconnectors and substations, and now to huge pylons covering 87 miles of countryside. These will blot the landscape and use up valuable growing land, filling the Fenland big skies. Knowing that his bow burns with gold, like my own, will he ensure that he joins my fight for our green and pleasant land and make sure that food security and energy security are not competitors?
My honourable friend raises an excellent point about our food security. We have taken steps that he has supported the government in doing to protect prime agricultural land from large-scale solar developments, which I know will be warmly welcomed. But also our announcements this week at the NFU conference demonstrate our support to increase our country's food security, backing farmers with more funding, enhancing their productivity to produce great British food. All of that, as he knows, and including our green and pleasant land, we put at risk by the party opposite. Not only do they not want to back our farmers, they also want to impose top-down planning targets which would concrete over the countryside that he and I both love.
In December, the Cabinet Minister for Equalities told this House that she had engaged, and I quote, extensively with LGBT organisations since her appointment 18 months ago. A Freedom of Information answer published this week reveals that, in fact, the Minister hasn't met a single LGBT organisation, but has met 2 fringe groups that actively campaign against transgender rights. What is the problem the Prime Minister and a section of his party have with trans people, and his Equalities Minister has with the truth?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've always said, first of all, this government has a proud track record of supporting those in the LGBT community and will continue to do so. And I've also always said that those who are questioning their gender and identity should be treated with the utmost dignity and compassion and sensitivity as they consider those questions. But it is completely reasonable, alongside that, to highlight the importance of biological sex when it comes to those questions. Nobody should be stigmatised or demonised for pointing out that fact.
Robert Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Education Select Committee has heard compelling evidence to support the strengthening of guidance to keep mobile phones out of classrooms and break times. But over the course of our screen time inquiry, we continue to hear deeply disturbing evidence about the risks to young people from too much exposure to social media too early. Can I urge the Prime Minister to seek the swiftest possible implementation of the Online Safety Act and to consider whether it is time to review the age of digital consent?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his work in this issue? And he knows that we do have a plan when it comes to education and protecting children online. The Secretary of State is making sure that we can implement the Online Safety Act as quickly as possible with Ofcom, but we have also published new guidance banning mobile phones in schools to minimise disruption and improve behaviour and educational attainment in the classroom. But we are crucially going beyond. The House will have an opportunity to consider its approach to the situation in Israel and Gaza. Our position is crystal clear. We have called and will always call for an immediate humanitarian pause, which would allow the safe release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza to create the conditions for a genuinely sustainable ceasefire. But just calling for an immediate full ceasefire now, which collapses it back into fighting in days or weeks, would not be in anyone's interest, Mr. Speaker. We are committed not just to immediate humanitarian pause, but also to finding a lasting resolution to this conflict, which delivers on the promise of a two-state solution and ensures that Israelis and Palestinians can live in the future with dignity and security.
Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems that with the exception of the British Transport Police, all other police forces will treat non-contact sex crimes as they would perhaps the theft of a bike, petty retail crime or antisocial behaviour. Will the Prime Minister facilitate a meeting between myself, colleagues and the Home Secretary in order to give priority to these acts of crime to ensure that women and young girls get the protection they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, of course we want women and girls to get the protection that they deserve, and I'm pleased that our violence against women and girls strategy is showing results, improving the safety of our streets, increasing sentences for rapists, but I will make sure that he gets the meeting that he needs with the Home Secretary or relevant policing ministers to discuss his concerns.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I heard the Prime Minister's responses to the Leader of the Opposition, and just like the Secretary of State's claims that delays on compensation are wild, baseless allegations, his answers are unbelievable. And the response from the benches opposite to the quote from my constituent Chris Head was completely disrespectful. The reality is, we wouldn't have any action without the ITV serialisation of the sub-postmaster scandal. You can shout all you like, but we all know that that's the case. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's promised a new law to swiftly exonerate and compensate victims, and today he said shortly. So will he commit today to ensuring that this is brought forward before the next general election?
Yes, the legislation will be brought forward before the House very, very soon, Mr Speaker.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Speaker, after Network Rail's so-called signalling improvement works, there's been traffic chaos and delays at level crossings across Egham. In fact, data analysed by my team shows, comparing September 22 with 23, there's been a 3,967% increase of wait times over 10 minutes when the barriers go down. Does my right honourable friend agree with me this is unacceptable and Network Rail need to sort it out?
Mr Speaker, I'm sorry to hear about the delays faced by my honourable friend's constituents. I know that will be disruptive to their lives. It's important that we have proper connectivity in our local areas, and I'll ensure that he gets the relevant meeting he needs to put pressure on Network Rail to improve the service they're providing.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Children and young adults are most likely to be the victims or the perpetrators of gun crime. Ava White was 12 years old when she was stabbed and killed by a 14-year-old in Liverpool city centre in 2021. Danny Jameson was 16 when he died as a result of knife crime. Their mothers, Leanne and Mandy, are campaigning for tougher sentences on knife crime. So will the Prime Minister support the Danny and Ava campaign to end the scourge of gun crime, knife crime, on our streets?
Mr Speaker, can I express my condolences to Danny and Ava's family and the family of all those young people whose lives have been so tragically cut short by knife crime. We do have plans in place to cut knife crime, and they are working. We've confiscated over 120,000 weapons. We've cut violent crime in half since 2010, and more dangerous criminals are going to jail for longer. But we are bringing forward legislation which would increase sentences for knife crime related things and ban zombie knives, and I very much hope that she and her party will support those proposals when they're put before the House.
Alexander Stafford.
Much indeed, Mr Speaker. After years of campaigning, it's great news that there'll be a direct bus link between two of my biggest towns in Rother Valley, between Diddington and Maltby. And this is great news. However, there's still lack of transport, bus transport to our local hospitals. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the South Yorkshire Mayor should use some of the resources to back my plan for transport for Rother Valley and make sure every single village and town has a direct bus link to our local hospitals?
Well, Mr Speaker, we absolutely know how vital bus services are for communities right across the country. Indeed, it's our most popular form of public transportation, which is why we have used some of the savings from HS2 to invest in bus services. We've capped bus services at £2 right across the country and provided his local authority with millions of pounds of more funding specifically to support local bus services. So I join him in calling on the Mayor to ensure direct bus routes to hospitals in my honourable friend's constituency and to make sure that people can see their loved ones at a distressing time.
Michelle Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the weekend, the people of South Wales marched in support of their steel industry, following the government's grubby deal with Tata that is now placing thousands of jobs at risk in Port Talbot and beyond. The Prime Minister is failing to protect our steel industry because he failed to place a red line on protecting jobs at the plant. So the Prime Minister now has a choice: work with the unions, Tata and the workforce to protect the industry and the jobs with investment, or to walk away and do what Tories always do and abandon South Wales communities yet again. Which is it, Prime Minister?
Mr Speaker, this government has worked hard to secure a long-term sustainable future for Welsh steelmaking and to grow the legacy of this important industry. That's why in the pandemic we stepped in to support CELTA, which he knows, safeguarding over 1,000 jobs and ensuring that that plant was sustainable. It's why we agreed one of the largest ever cash grants of £500 million to Tata Steel to safeguard at least 5,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker, which would otherwise have been lost. And perhaps he might want to ask why the Welsh Labour government did not put a penny in to support that deal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many who try to imitate Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Watford area continues to be the proud home of the National Lottery, employing over 900 people. So would my right honourable friend and the Prime Minister and the whole Cabinet join me in celebrating the successful handover from Camelot to Allwyn on the 1st of February and the £48 billion raised by the National Lottery players funding 700,000 projects so far, I'm sure, in everyone's constituency. Thank you.
Well, I join with my honourable friend in offering his congratulations and thanks to everyone involved with the National Lottery. All of us in our constituency have seen the incredible benefit from the investments they're making, and he's absolutely right to make sure that they get the praise they deserve today in Parliament.
Graham Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been at it again. In his answer to a previous question, he was boasting about transferring investment from the north of England into the south of England. When he came to Manchester in the autumn to insult the people of the north of England and cancelled HS2, proudly cancelled it, was he aware then that because the trains have to split without the HS2 lines and they don't tilt, he will be slowing services down and reducing capacity? Did he know that, or didn't he care?
Mr. Speaker, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, our plans to continue with Phase 1 mean that we can handle triple the capacity that is currently being used on the line. The second thing is every penny of the £19.8 billion from the northern bit of HS2 will stay in the north, being invested in services that people use, like local buses, and will be delivered quicker. And thirdly, he's critical of the decision. I still haven't quite figured out what the Labour Party's position on this is. Do they support the redeployment of £36 billion of HS2 savings in transport across the rest of the country, or do they not? As ever with Mr. Speaker, you don't know what they stand for, they can't say what they do, and they just take Britain back to square one.
That concludes Prime Minister's questions. Let the Chamber... I will take points of order, but I will let the Chamber clear. Okay. You know what? I'm just going to let the Chamber clear. Point of order, Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I wonder if you could clarify for the House how we could get some transparency to the questions that the Prime Minister failed to answer about the Business Secretary's dispute with the former chair of the Post Office and whose recollection of that meeting is, in fact, correct. And have we got any recourse as members of this House to get the minutes of that meeting? Because the Business Secretary said at no point was anyone told to delay compensation payments either by an official or a minister or any government department. And what we've heard this morning, and the Prime Minister failed to answer in Prime Minister's questions today, doesn't answer that question for us. I don't know if you could help clarify that matter. I don't know if you speak to it.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order. It really isn't a
matter for the chair, but she has come in very quickly after Prime Minister's questions to put her point on the record, and I know that the Treasury bench will have heard what she has to say. Point of order, Liam Burke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if you could advise me how we can get to the bottom of exactly what is going on with our Canadian trade talks. On the 25th of January, Politico broke a story about a breakdown in our trade talks with Canada, and I asked the Secretary of State about this, and she said this: "This is a good opportunity for me to state explicitly that the talks have not broken down." Now, on our committee, we trust but verify. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, you will be as surprised as I was to hear the news relayed in a letter from the Canadian High Commissioner that says, "As far as I'm aware, since the UK announced its pause on the 25th of January, there have been neither negotiations nor technical discussions with respect to any of the outstanding issues." Now, Canada is a NATO ally, it's a Commonwealth partner, it's one of our biggest export markets. How do we get to the bottom of whether these trade talks are going on in the Secretary of State's mind or whether they're happening in real life?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable gentleman for his point of order and for giving notice of it. As he knows, I am not responsible for the accuracy of ministers' statements in the House, but I am sure, again, that the Treasury bench will have heard his remarks, and also, obviously, as chair of the Select Committee, he will have further opportunities to pursue the matter directly with the Secretary of State, and I'm pretty sure that that is what he intends to do. Thank you. Point of order. I'll take John MacDonald first because he stood first.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's large numbers of our constituents who have come to lobby Parliament today, obviously because the issue of Gaza is so close to their hearts. In Westminster Hall, there's only a limited number that are being allowed in, even though there's quite sizable amounts of space. So many of the constituents are actually being forced to stand out in the rain. Would it be possible to see what could be done to accommodate more into Westminster Hall as they then come and filter on the green card system?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable gentleman for his point of order. I will certainly. This is a matter, obviously, that the House authorities will be dealing with, and I will ensure that his comments are fed back to see if anything further can be done. But I'm sure that he will appreciate that if there are large numbers of people trying to gain entrance, then that can cause some delays inevitably. And I'm sure we're all sorry about that, but as I say, I will feed back his comments. Point of order, Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Later on today, we will obviously be casting votes on very sensitive matters that affect the whole House. At the start of that debate, no doubt Mr. Speaker will be announcing which amendments, if any, he is going to allow to be put to this House. When he was elected, he gave a solemn promise that he would publish the advice that he got from the clerk of the House when he made controversial decisions. This will clearly, I don't know what he's going to decide or what his recommendation is, but could you prevail on him when he comes back to the chair to release the advice that is given by the clerk in whatever decision he comes to on the amendments to the SNP motion that we'll be debating this afternoon?
Transparency. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I'm sure that his comments will have been heard and that Mr. Speaker will make his decision in due course with all the comments that the honourable gentleman has raised about publication. But I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you. Point of order, Carl Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if you could give me some advice. My office wrote to the Home Secretary
more than 6 weeks ago, and we've still not received a response from him about an issue raised by a constituent. It's becoming increasingly clear that ministers are either willfully refusing to respond to members of Parliament or simply, perhaps rather worryingly, just treating members of Parliament with sheer contempt. What do we do, Madam Deputy Speaker, to force ministers to do their duty and respond appropriately to members of this House?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I know this is an issue that has been raised with the Leader of the House at business questions. I know the Leader of the House takes this very seriously. The honourable gentleman might like to raise it on Thursday again at business questions, but I do have confidence that the Treasury bench has heard his comments, have written them down and will feed them back.
Point of order, Madam Deputy.
Point of order, Dame Diana Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, you will know that yesterday in the House there was an urgent question on border security. Later on that afternoon, it became public that the independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration had been sacked by the Home Secretary, who it is claimed the Home Secretary lost confidence in the independent inspector. It was quite clear from the urgent question yesterday that one of the issues that the Chief Inspector was most exercised by was the 15 reports that he had lodged with the Home Office since April 2023, which have not been published. The agreement with the Chief Inspector is that reports that he submits to the Home Office should be published within 8 weeks. Clearly, a number of those reports are well overdue. I wondered, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you'd heard had any indication from ministers about whether they were planning to come to the House to make a statement about Mr David Neil and the fact that he was sacked yesterday afternoon, and more importantly, what's happened to the 15 reports that the Chief Inspector has lodged since April last year, many of which are on important issues. Further to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is an issue about the government introducing legislation which this House is very concerned about in terms of the Rwanda policy and asylum seekers being moved to Rwanda to have their claims processed. But in terms of the lack of anyone now in the Chief Inspector role, that will mean that there is no independent oversight or scrutiny at a time when a major policy decision is going to be implemented by the government. The Home Affairs Select Committee is particularly concerned by any delay. We've heard we saw in the Times, there is a report that it will be 6 to 9 months before a new independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration is appointed. Can you advise the best way forward, Madam Deputy Speaker?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her point of order. She's raised a number of points. I have not received any notification that a statement is forthcoming on the point that she made. She did refer to an urgent question yesterday. Two things. First of all, I know the Right Honourable Lady regularly attends business questions. This may be something that she might like to press the Leader of the House on at business questions. The Treasury bench has heard again what she has had to say and will feed it back. And I'm sure in her role as Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, she may also have other means to pursue the issues that she's raised, particularly perhaps in respect of reports that she may be able to ask for, but she will possibly know more than me about that. Thank you. Point of order, Matt Weston.
Madam Deputy Speaker, a year ago tomorrow, I raised with the Prime Minister a really important point, which was about the payment of a fine to the EU of £2.3 billion. Following that question to him, I wrote to the Prime Minister asking for an explanation. A year on, I've not had a reply. Now, I would have thought it would be in the interest of all in this House to understand how it was that a payment of £2.3 billion was paid as a fine for late payment to the EU, and that's in our interest to understand what happened. So is there any recourse that I can take to understand what happened?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. Again, I don't have responsibility for the answers given, but he has. It may well be that he could pursue this through further questions to the table office. Again, the Treasury bench will have heard what he has to say, and I very much hope they will feed back this rather long list of messages to the government. Thank you. We now... Point of order, Dame Angela Eagle, but I hope it will be quite a short one.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Quicker if people are shouting out. So some silence so I can hear the point of order and deal with it quickly. Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the Treasury Select Committee, we've been considering the work of UK government investments across a range of issues, and we have now got to a situation. Now got to a situation where quite complex decisions, which appear to have been referred to at board meetings of the Post Office, are obtuse to us. And I wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, given the disagreement between government ministers and those representatives from UK GI, which are on the board of the Post Office, are very obtuse and hard to unravel, whether she has any advice on how we can bring these important issues to the floor of the House.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is obviously on the Treasury Select Committee and a senior member of it. Again, we have noted what she said. It will be fed back, but she might like to pursue it either through the Treasury Committee or even perhaps talk to the chair of the Business Select Committee, who I know are looking at this at the moment. Right. Can we now move on, please, to the 10-minute rule bill? Dr. Therese Coffey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision about licences authorising the driving of motor vehicles of certain classes and for connected purposes. The principal purpose of this bill is to reform Section 5.2 of the Motor Vehicles Driving Licences Regulations 1999. These are EU rules that were put into UK law and reduced the number of vehicles that could be driven after passing a general motoring licence test. So-called grandfather rights were maintained for people like me who had passed their driving test prior to 1997 to continue to be able to drive certain categories of vehicles, including minibuses and medium-sized goods vehicles, which fall under the categories D1 and C1. In particular, I'm seeking reform to our driving licences so that the C1 and D1 categories are automatically given to everybody who has passed a driving test for a car, in the same way that happened for those of us who passed our test before 1997. This opportunity is a Brexit bonus and to reform driving licence regulations that were put in place thanks to our membership of the EU is motivated by my intention to firstly support rural communities and secondly unlock economic growth opportunities. I recently raised this issue in the House in a debate on the 31st of January and gave notice then of my intention to seek to change the law. Other honourable members voiced their support for a change, particularly focused on community transport and the D1 category. While I do not seek to repeat everything I said in that debate, since then the Community Transport Association and others have contacted me to voice their full support for a change in the law. This whole issue first came to my attention when I visited Halesworth Area Community Transport in my constituency and was told about its challenges in getting more drivers. to drive a van for that not-for-profit organisation, and indeed drive a minibus for that not-for-profit organisation as it then was, people had to pay £2,000 to £3,000 to do a course and pass a test to acquire a D1 licence due to the regulations. This problem was reinforced when I visited the Volunteer Help Centre in Southwold, who told a similar story. When I went to see the then Transport Minister, I was told that they were EU regulations and that as long as we were part of the EU, there was absolutely no way we could change them. Now, the Community Transport Association has given me further examples, including Bexhill Community Bus, who stated that we are a small community bus operator and rely on persons with D1 on their licence. We are facing a future when Cat B drivers lose the automatic right to drive a minibus and would face the expense of training all new volunteer drivers. Or indeed from Changing Lives Together, an organisation in Cheshire who've supported a change in the law, saying this is very much needed, we are recruiting from a smaller pool of people every year and it's causing real problems across our area. This is particularly challenging for community transport associations that help people with disabilities in their daily lives. This was recognised in the government's National Disability Strategy, and there was a commitment from the Department for Transport to help tackle shortages in community transport drivers. It is clear there is a real need for reform for making it easier to acquire a D1 licence to support such community transport ventures and other uses of a D1 licence to support our rural communities and avoid losing such services or turning them into exclusively paid services. I turn to the benefits of reform of C1 licences. These are for medium-sized goods vehicles, not HGVs. These are the kind used to do a lot of local delivery jobs, but also applies to horse boxes and vehicles like an ambulance. And I suggest that by opening up this category, perhaps with some conditions like a minimum age of, say, 25 or having to have held a driving licence for 2 or more years, this would open up an instant economic boost without a cost to government and help productivity in the supply chain. Now, we have experienced in recent years a shortage of HGV drivers due to a number of factors, particularly during COVID. And one of the reasons why there was a shortage is that HGV drivers had started switching to jobs using these medium-sized vehicles, for which they were automatically qualified by holding an HGV licence. The department then took some sensible temporary measures to help address that shortage. Now, as an aside, Mr Deputy Speaker, regarding cost of acquiring a C1 licence, this is typically £2,000 to £3,000, similar to the D1 licence. But for HGV driving qualifications, there are apprenticeship courses available, allowing businesses to use their apprenticeship levy funding. However, there is not one for securing a C1 driving licence, and I've been informed that previous attempts to secure one have been rejected, and as it is not considered that a 12-month course and practical experience is needed to gain this qualification. Now, within government, I've been trying to persuade the Department for Transport to look at this opportunity, and I was delighted when they issued a call for evidence in August 2022. As the then Minister wrote in its foreword, my honourable friend, the member for Lincoln, the licensing improvements regarding HGV drivers, to which I referred above, were achievable partly due to the fact that we had left the European Union and had the freedom to change our legislation to improve our testing and licensing regime. The call for evidence includes seeking evidence on the economic benefits of widening the recruitment pool for medium-sized goods vehicles and minibus drivers, which may attract more people to the industry and support economic growth by further strengthening our supply chain. Mr Deputy Speaker, there was exceptionally strong support for the changes to both C1 and D1 licences, and I particularly commend the submission made by the Community Transport Association regarding D1. Businesses also gave very strong support to C1 changes, citing significant economic advantages. Reasons given included it would be much more efficient to run a single trip in a 4.6-tonne van than to be restricted to multiple trips, as it would require fewer journeys to transport the goods. In essence, it would mean fewer vehicles on the road and fewer trips. That is good news for the economy and also good news for the environment. In that same summary, though, it was pretty clear that the department did not want to make any changes, which disappointed me. But as is self-evident, I have not given up, as I think these simple changes would bring both economic growth and be hugely beneficial for rural communities. I'm also aware that the East of England Ambulance Service were hindered in new drivers being able to drive ambulances due to delays in C1 assessments, despite them already undertaking advanced driver training, the Blues and Twos as known, for the emergency vehicles. I'm pleased to say that has now been rectified, but nevertheless, there was still a barrier. Further, while I'm in the mood for sensible reform through this bill, I think we should consider the economic benefits of extending the lifetime of driving licences, which due to EU law are currently at 10 years for a car and 5 years for several other vehicles, including those for driving horse boxes. This feels unnecessarily burdensome and would be benefit not only the cost of processing, but also the cost to drivers across the country. Now, I know that my honourable friend, the Minister, is listening hard to these proposals for reform, and I welcome some of the discussions we've already had. I do suggest to the Government that reforms would be exceptionally popular with community transport associations across the country and with businesses large and small. I do understand the issues raised regarding safety. I consider that driving tests have become considerably more difficult since I passed my test, but I do think there is a way to address some of the concerns raised by certain campaign groups. I'm also aware that the Government signed up to the Vienna Convention in 2018, and though these regulations were already in place, and indeed we have applied various reservations to that convention so as not to disrupt our common sense practices in this country that we have, like not having to wait for the green light of a pedestrian crossing to cross the road when no traffic is coming in either direction, which, as we may know, is a criminal offence in other countries in Europe. Mr. Speaker, I believe this is a real opportunity to adopt some sensible approaches, and that, as I say, would be welcome across the House. It would be a Brexit bonus, it would increase community transport, it would remove an unnecessary costly barrier for business, and recognising the strengthening of the driving test in the past 25 years, we should have the confidence to back British drivers with British rules. I would like to work with the Government during the passage of this bill, and I commend it for introduction and to proceed towards a second reading.
Question is, the Right Honourable Lady have leave to bring in her bill. Before I call the Honourable Gentleman, could I just gently remind him that this has to be a speech in opposition to the bill. I take it that the Honourable Gentleman wishes to speak in opposition to the motion. Sir Chris Bryan.
Sir Roger, I'm very grateful for your reminding me that I have to speak in opposition to the legislation, but since the Government itself opposes the measure, as the member herself has just pointed out, I would presume that the Government's going to be opposing this measure as well this afternoon. Let's be clear. Not all the measures that come from the right, whilst I commend the Right Honourable Lady for her diligence as a backbench member coming to this House and making a series of different 10-minute rule measures over the last year. For instance, last year she brought forward the Schools Gender and Parental Rights Bill, which fell at the first hurdle because it didn't get second reading. 40 people voted no and 34 voted aye. We have the same right to do so today if we think that her measure is neither appropriate, relevant or necessary. So let me go through. She referred, Sir Roger, to the fact that she considers this to be...
Order. Other members may not wish to hear the Honourable Gentleman, but I do, and I need to know whether the Honourable Gentleman is in order. So it would be helpful if Honourable members could either, if they want to have private conversations, have them outside, or keep quiet. Sir Chris Bryan.
I'm grateful, Sir Roger. My main objection is that the Honourable Lady seeks to make this a Brexit bonus, as she referred to it. I disagree with that very concept for a start, because I believe that regulatory convergence rather than regulatory divergence is probably more useful, both in terms of British drivers knowing where they stand driving in this country and in other countries in Europe, and secondly, in terms of other European drivers being able to drive in the UK. Of course, there are other areas where there might be Brexit bonuses, because you might, for instance, be trading with other countries elsewhere in the world. But when it comes to driving licences, specifically, the only other countries that we are likely to be dealing with are other countries within the European Union. So I believe, and I think the Government believes too, because so far the Department for Transport has refused to budge in the direction that the Right Honourable Member suggests, that this is an inappropriate measure that would do harm rather than good and would not lead to greater safety, would actually imperil safety in the UK. Secondly, we signed up to the Vienna Conventions in 2018, And of course, Mr. Sir Roger, as you know, exemptions are allowed under the Vienna Convention. The Right Honourable Lady, in her previous speech on this matter, pointed out that one of the exemptions that we've introduced relates to when you can cross the road in the UK when a traffic light seems to suggest that you can't. That, under the Vienna Convention, we would not normally be able to do, but we have been able to amend it. So there is an argument, which the Right Honourable Lady has not made, that this legislation is not necessary to achieve the same end that she is trying to achieve. She also refers to the £2,000 to £3,000 fee. She makes a legitimate point here, which is that some charities would like to be able to use minibuses, which, when they are fully loaded, do go over the 3.5-tonne limit. And the £2,000 to £3,000 fee is a significant one, which can impede them from being able to do their work as we would all want them to do. However, that is a matter that is in the power of government without any legislative need for any legislation. The further point, Sir Roger, is that the government has so far consulted, as she referred to, on this measure, but has decided not to proceed. It would be useful, I think, if the government were able to tell us why it's not chosen to proceed. My suspicion is that that's because it believes that this would not be a measure that would be safe. The Right Honourable Lady also said that she wanted to extend in this legislation the length of time for which a licence fee is provided. Now, this would be clearly in direct contravention of the Vienna Convention. Presently, it is set at 10 years. I personally think that that is the safest way in this country to make sure that every driver on the road has a valid driving licence, which is actually up to date, has the correct address on it, and that the person may well be properly insured. I'm sure many of us in this country, in our own constituencies, have come across cases where people have been financially disadvantaged because the crash that they have been involved in has been with somebody who hasn't got a proper driving licence, it's out of date, and they're not properly insured. I think that the Right Honourable Lady's measure would drive a coach and horses, if you forgive the pun, through that. There is, Mr. Sir Roger, another issue, which is that in recent years we have had a significant problem with getting enough HGV drivers in the UK. Now, I believe that this measure would make that substantially more difficult. That adds costs to businesses up and down the country. It makes it more difficult because many of the present HGV drivers driving on British roads are not British, they are of other nationalities. If you have a separate set of regulations for the UK, completely separate for the UK from the rest of the European Union, then you simply make it more difficult for businesses to do their work, and you also increase an additional layer of regulatory burden, which is a cost to businesses. My final point, Sir Roger, my final point is that at the moment, on the order paper at the moment, there are 78 private members' bills listed. That would call to be read for second reading on the 23rd of February, the 1st of March, the 15th of March or the 22nd of March, all of which before the final date for a general election on the 2nd of May. I think not a single one of them will probably enter the statute books. There are actually 26 in the name of members called Christopher, and I feel rather left out that not one of them comes from myself. But the serious point is that we keep on putting more bills onto the order paper and not taking them off and putting them onto the statute book, because we still have a system for 10-minute rule bills and private members' bills which is completely and utterly bust. The Procedure Committee has time and time and time again said that we bring the whole process into disrepute, and that's why we shouldn't be adding yet another 10-minute rule bill to the order paper when we have no intention of putting it on the statute book. I therefore urge all honourable members to vote against the measure today.
Question is, the Right Honourable Lady have leave to bring in her bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobbies. Is that the Right Honourable Lady have leave to bring in her bill? As many of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no? No. Tell us for the ayes, Flick Drummond and Justin Tomlinson. Tell us for the noes, Jeff Smith and Christian Wakeford.
Lock the doors.
Can the sergeant look into the door lobby? Order. The ayes to the right, 63. The noes to the left, 81.
The ayes to the right, 63. The noes to the left, 81. The noes have it, the noes have it. And look! We now come to the SNP motion on Gaza. I understand that the second motion on the order paper will not be moved today. This is a highly sensitive subject on which feelings are running high in the House, in the nation and throughout the world. I think it's important on this occasion that the House is able to consider the widest possible range of options. I have therefore decided to select the amendments both in the name of the Prime Minister and in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Because the operation of Standing Order number 31 will prevent another amendment from being moved after the Government has moved its amendment. I will exceptionally call the Opposition Frontbench spokesperson to move their amendment at the beginning of the debate. Once the SNP spokesperson have moved their motion, at the end of the debate, the House will have an opportunity to take a decision on the official opposition amendment. If that is agreed to, there is a final question on the main motion as amended. If the official opposition amendment is not agreed to, I will call the Minister to move the government amendment formally. That will engage the... Order! I'm going to finish. That will engage the provisions of Standing Order number 31. So the next vote will be on the original words in the SNP motion. If that is not agreed to, then the House will have the opportunity to vote on the government amendment. Proceeding this way will allow a vote to take place potentially on all proposals from each of the three main parties. I can inform the House, just let me finish. I can inform the House that there is a precedent for an official opposition spokesperson being called second in the debate and moving amendment before... No, we're not. Or does somebody want to leave? I'm determined to finish. Before a minister was called to speak in the debate in the circumstances. However, no government amendment has been tabled. I should also inform that the Clerk of the House will be placing in the library a letter to me about today's proceedings. I have asked for that letter to be made available in the vote office as soon as possible. Finally, I should tell the House that, in my opinion, the operation of Standing Order number 31, which governs the way amendments to the opposition day motions are dealt with, reflects an outdated approach which restricts order. You'll be going and not be voting. Well, that's the first one to leave then. If you want to, do it. Now then, firstly, I should tell the House, in my opinion, the operation of Standing Order, which governs the way amendments, opposition motions are dealt with, reflects an outdated approach, which restricts the operations which can put the House. It is my intention to ask the Procedure Committee to consider the operation. I now call Brendan O'Hara to move the motion.
Point of order.
Point of order. Oh, wait.
I appreciate
appreciate what you've outlined here, but I seek your advice because obviously I've taken advice from the clerks. This is the SNP's opposition day. And the purpose of an opposition day is for our party to have the ability to put forward our business. We've already had a significant delay to the start of this motion, which has significant interest to the extent we dropped our second motion, and now we're completely appear to be doing things in a way that's never been done before. Can I ask for your advice, Mr. Speaker, and what is the point of an opposition day if it's going to be done like this?
And then, can I just say, I think you will want to vote at some point. Clapping isn't going to assist it. A point of order has been raised by the SNP Chief Whip. As I say, I've made a judgment on a precedent that's been done before. I have viewed it as that is my ruling, and I'm going to stand by the ruling, and I'm not taking any more pound towards Brendan O'Hara. No more. Brendan O'Hara, speak. Done. Brendan O'Hara, I'm not taking any more points of order, Mr. Linden. Brendan O'Hara.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the SNP motion that's been tabled in my name and those of my right honourable friends, which calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza from all combatants. And I wish to put on record, once again, our unequivocal condemnation of the Hamas attack of October the 7th, and repeat both our call for the immediate release of all the hostages and to see those involved in those atrocities called to account for their actions.
Hear, hear.
The war in Gaza is one of the great defining moments of our time. Yet until today, this House has not been given the opportunity to debate both the unfolding human catastrophe and the wider implications for regional and global stability. Nor have we had the opportunity to debate the urgent and pressing need for an immediate ceasefire as an essential first step to finding a lasting and just peace. Mr. Speaker, no one would deny that Israel has the right to defend itself. Every country has that right. What no country has the right to do, however, is to lay siege to a civilian population, carpet bomb densely inhabited areas, drive people from their homes, erase an entire civilian infrastructure, and impose a collective punishment involving the cutting off of water, electricity, food and medicine from civilians. And no country, regardless of who they are, in the name of self-defence, can kill civilians at such a pace and on such a scale that in just 16 weeks, almost 30,000 are known to have died, with a further 80,000 injured. Mr. Speaker, we cannot. Self-defence can kill civilians at such a pace and on such a scale that in just 16 weeks, almost 30,000 are known to have died, with a further 80,000 injured. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow the core principle of self-defence to be so ruthlessly exploited and manipulated in order to legitimise the slaughter of innocent civilians. If we do that, then what hope is there for the future of international rules-based order? An order created to protect people from atrocities, not to be used as a smokescreen to hide the execution of them. If we accept what Israel is doing in Gaza as the new norm, as the new accepted standard of self-defence, then we undermine that core principle which is meant to protect and defend us. And therefore we cannot accept that what is happening now is self-defence, not just because of the precedent that it will send. And I have no doubt that that thought contributed to the United States issuing its clearest warning yet to Netanyahu, that they would not support his proposed ground offensive in Rafah. And this is why the UN Security Council are currently debating a ceasefire. And as we speak today, and even the US have recognised that a ceasefire must happen for a peaceful political solution. Of course, it does not go nearly far enough, but it does show that things are moving, opinions are changing, and the guarantees Israel has come to rely upon are gradually withdrawing. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think there are very few people, not only in this House, but in this country at the moment, who would differ from the sentiments being expressed by the Scottish National Party spokesperson here today. We all watch with horror each night the torture of the people in Gaza, and we remember every morning the pain being felt by the families whose loved ones are being held hostage. But would the honourable member not agree with me that we would serve their cause so much better, and ourselves in this place, if we built a consensus behind an opinion today, rather than indulging in petty party politics, which serves no one well?
I thank the Honourable Lady for the intervention. I'm not quite sure she means about petty party politics, and the behaviour we're seeing today has been pretty petty, but we are all about a consensus. Anything that can build a consensus for peace, which has to be based around peace, justice and an immediate ceasefire, then we will be there.
Very grateful for the honourable member for giving way. If I could just highlight something that I think is more important in some of the conversations we've had to this moment. On Monday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement saying that UN experts had uncovered that Israeli forces in Gaza and the West Bank are being accused of egregious human rights abuses, including arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killings and sexual violence, including rape. The Israeli government, of course, have dismissed this without any investigation. Does the honourable member agree with me that this government should be pushing hard for a proper investigation, for people to be held to account for these kinds of gross human rights abuses?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I think it is vitally important that whether it's a perceived ally or a perceived foe, an egregious breach of human rights is an egregious breach of human rights and should be taken as exactly that and should be investigated without fear or favour.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I think one of the things which has defined this House over the last couple of years has been the unity over Ukraine, and it's been really important that we've all stood together on all sides against Putin. Can I just appeal to my honourable friend to reflect on what's required of all of us today, because the issue is one of principle, of those that are facing famine and death in Gaza. And it's important on all of us across this House to show the appropriate leadership, to come together, to speak up against the human rights abuses that are taking place. And woe betide any of us that fail to show that particular leadership. Now is the time, today is the time, for this House to come together and stand up for those in Palestine that need our support.
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I think we all have a part to play in bringing peace and saving innocent lives. So I was somewhat surprised to hear the Shadow Foreign Secretary on Sunday when he seemed to dismiss and downplay the importance of this debate, when he said on the radio, it's not this vote that will bring about a ceasefire. And of course, he is right. Voting for an immediate ceasefire today won't by itself bring about the end of the slaughter. But the impact and the optics of this Parliament, hitherto one of Israel's staunchest allies, saying enough is enough and calling for an immediate ceasefire, would be enormous. And while not in and of itself able to bring about a ceasefire, support for this motion would further remove that ever-thinning veil of legitimacy that the UK's continued support gives to Israel's merciless war in Gaza. And it would show the beleaguered and battered people of Palestine that we do care and that we have not forgotten them. And calling for an immediate ceasefire would also be a pivotal moment in the campaign to stop UK arms sales to Israel. Because as the South African Foreign Minister said last week, the decision to stop the fighting in Gaza is in the hands of the countries that supply Israel with their weapons. And who knows, it might actually help some of the UK's political establishment and those seeking to aspire to that position to locate their moral compass.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He refers to the way of stopping the conflict. Does he not agree with me that the only way, the most certain way of ending this conflict is by Hamas releasing the hostages, including the 9-month-old baby who was kidnapped by Hamas? And if Hamas released the hostages straight away, that is a surefire way to ceasefire, and that is what we should be talking about.
Send the motion.
I think the very first sentence I said was we utterly condemn the Hamas attack and we implore them to release the hostages, but there has to be a pathway to reaching that. And so the Shadow Foreign Secretary, when he said that this would not bring about a ceasefire, was right. But to try and downplay the importance of this motion does not serve him well. And I do suspect that these moments do not come around very often, as he knows, and he understands only too well the importance of tonight's vote. Because it's moments like these, which shape the ethical identity of a country. And it's the decisions that we take now which will reverberate down the decades, and they will define who we are and what we stand for. And that is why we are calling so clearly and unambiguously for an immediate ceasefire. Because anything else presupposes that there can be a military solution to this conflict. And any other form of words threatens to give credence to the idea that Israel, by dint of deploying its massive military capacity in Gaza, that will somehow be enough to destroy Hamas. When in reality, as everyone knows, and indeed history tells us, the only possible solution to this crisis is a political solution.
For the purpose of clarity, I could understand his argument better if he were talking about what the Americans seem to call a temporary ceasefire to see if more hostages could be released. But he appears to be calling for an unconditional ceasefire, which, and I see people nodding, which would leave all the hostages at the mercy of Hamas. And does not that put Israel in the position where previously they had to release 1,000 people who had been criminally convicted to get one soldier back, and one of the people they released was the person who organised the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October.
I thank the honourable member for that. I am absolutely clear. There has to be a roadway, there has to be a path towards peace, and that has to start with an immediate ceasefire. If it doesn't, then there is no pathway. I will address directly the issue of humanitarian pauses in a moment. But, Mr. Speaker, when the SNP last called for a vote on a ceasefire on the 15th of November, the death toll in Gaza stood at 11,320. Already a heartbreaking number of people killed. Just yesterday, Johns Hopkins University and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine released their analysis, which showed that if this conflict continues on the same trajectory, there will be between 58,000 and 75,000 additional civilian Palestinian deaths in the next 6 months. So we know categorically what the consequences of inaction will be. And no one can in the future claim that they did not know or that they did not understand the consequences of what they were doing tonight.
My honourable friend give way?
Absolutely.
Very grateful to him for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree that while some rules may be more malleable than others, the rules of international law are very clear on self-defence, and that the use of self-defence must be proportionate, and that on any view, 30,000 civilians dead, the majority of whom are women and children, is excessive and not a proportionate use of force?
I thank my honourable friend for that, and she's absolutely right. And the danger that we have is if we accept Israel's response as being the new norm, then the danger that everybody across the world, regardless of their circumstances, are put in is terrifying. It's a terrifying example to set and a terrifying precedent which should worry us all, and I thank her for that intervention. And to address the point from earlier on from the honourable member, if no one can argue, I believe, with any credibility on what they used to call, and some people still do, humanitarian pauses, that convoluted idea of an organised fixed-term pause in the killing, one which would allow emergency aid into Gaza only to have the carnage resume at a pre-arranged date and time. And I think that should be seen for what it always was: a smokescreen for politicians to hide behind while waiting to see which direction the wind of public opinion might blow. Well, we have seen the way that public opinion is blowing across the world and here in the UK, with millions taking to the streets and polls showing 75% support plus for an immediate ceasefire. And the harsh reality is that the government, having expended so much political and diplomatic capital on defending and justifying Israel's prosecution of this war, now finds itself stuck on the wrong side of global opinion. And consequently, the UK's international reputation has been so diminished that when the process of finding a just, lasting peace in the region does begin, the UK will struggle to play a meaningful part in it. So if this government cannot see the long-term damage that it is doing, then it's up to this House to tell them by demanding that immediate ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire which has already been endorsed by Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the Archbishop of York, Scotland's Catholic bishops, the Catholic bishops of the Conference of England and Wales, the Church of England's House of Bishops, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Quakers, the leaders of the Methodists and the United Reformed Church, the Lutheran World Federation, the UN Secretary-General, the UN General Assembly President, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, Save the Children, Amnesty, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, ActionAid, the International Rescue Committee, Action Against Hunger, Care International, Medical Aid for Palestinians, the Council for Arab-British Understanding, the Balfour Project, Islamic Relief, Christian Aid, War on Want, the Carter Centre, War Child, Unite the Union, Unison, the King Centre, World Vision, WaterAid, Tear Fund, Street Child, Star Network, Peace Direct, Mercy Corps, Civicus, and scores more of churches, NGOs, charities and individuals who have seen Israel completely abandon international humanitarian law by imposing their collective punishment on a defenceless civilian population. A civilian population in which just 16 weeks an estimated 18,000 Palestinian children have been left without a single living relative.
The honourable member for giving way. The only way we can ensure a permanent end to the cycle of violence is by facilitating the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. The main blocker to this is Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has doubled down on his opposition to an independent Palestinian state. Does my honourable friend agree that the UK must show strong opposition to Netanyahu's plans by unilaterally recognizing the state of Palestine as a matter of urgency.
I could not agree more with my honourable friend. Absolutely. The United Kingdom has shown a dereliction of duty towards the Palestinians, and we have been very, very supportive and will continue to be supportive of a Palestinian state. But all of those organisations and individuals and churches that I listed, they will not ignore the evidence of their own eyes, nor will they turn a deaf ear to the cries of suffering Palestinians, and neither should we. Mr. Speaker, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once wrote, "In silence we become accomplices, but when we speak, every word has the power to change the world." So as I bring these remarks to a close, I want to share with the House the words of those being forced to live through this hell every single day. 30-year-old Islam Harb lost 3 of his 4 children, along with his mother, 2 of his sisters and both his brothers, when a missile hit their home. Islam said, "My family spent days trying to dig the remains of the dead out of the rubble. The body of my brother Khalil was found 200 metres away from the house due to the power of the strike, in pieces. My children's small bodies were torn to pieces." His surviving sister, Ahlam, added, "My brother Mohammed was only recognised by his hair. Nothing was left of my brother Khalil except his hand." And 30-year-old Ahmad Nassam, a physiotherapist, lost his wife and 3 children, aged 5, 4 and just 3 months, along with both of his parents and his sister, when a missile hit their home. He said it took him 4 days to retrieve the body of his baby daughter, Ayla, from the rubble. She was only recognised by the clothes she was wearing. That same blast decapitated his 5-year-old daughter, Arwa. He said, "When the war started, I had only one mission in my life: to protect my children. I wish I were with them when the house was hit. My body survived, but my spirit died with my children. It was crushed under the rubble with them." And that's why tonight really matters. That's why it'll be times like these for which we are all remembered. We will be remembered for what we did and for what we chose not to do. And for decades hence, people will say to us, "You were there," and they will ask us, "What did you do?" And some will have to say they chose to engage in a debate on semantics over sustainable or humanitarian causes, while others will say that they chose to give Netanyahu both the weapons and the political cover he required to allow him to prosecute his relentless war. But some of us in this House can say, when we saw 30,000 innocent people killed, when we saw almost 100,000 innocent people injured, when we saw tens of thousands of traumatised children with physical and mental damage that will last for the rest of their lives, when we saw 2 million people displaced from their homes, when we saw refugee camps bombed, when we saw hundreds of journalists killed, when we see hospitals reduced to rubble, when we saw places of worship and the people sheltering in them attacked, and when we saw ambulances which had been sent to rescue children being hit by missiles, with those rescued children still inside, at that point we will say that we chose to do everything we possibly could to make it stop. But we also chose to listen. We listened to the International Court of Justice when they determined there were plausible grounds that Israel is in the process of committing genocide. We listened to the anguished pleas of innocent Palestinians begging for our help to make it stop. And we listened to the anger of millions of people from across these islands, and then we used our immensely privileged position as members of this House to demand an immediate ceasefire. So by supporting the SNP's motion tonight calling for that immediate ceasefire, this House can put itself on the side of peace, it can put itself on the side of justice, it can put itself on the side of the people, and it can put itself on the right side of history.
The question is, as on the order, order! Can I just say to members, clapping, I have a list. And I can rule who speaks where. So I think we need to hear a debate, not a debating society. The question is, as on the order paper, I call David Lammy to move the amendment A in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Senate Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the Labour amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition and my name. There are times when this House can come together with clarity and a unity of purpose, and I hope that this can be one of those moments. Mr. Speaker, it's with pain and sadness that this House gathers here today. The pain and sadness of war that has gone on too long. It's now 137 days since the appalling 7th of October massacre. And since that day, the killing has gone on. Flattened cities, ransacked kibbutzim, teeming refugee camps, hostages in chains. We've seen it all on our TV screens and phone screens. Mr. Speaker, a ground offensive in Rafah would be a humanitarian disaster, a moral catastrophe, and a strategic mistake. It must not happen. That is our position. That is the position of the European Union. It's the position of our friends in the Arab world. It's the position of our Five Eyes partners in Australia, in Canada and New Zealand. We must not just avert a ground invasion of Rafah, essential though it is. All violence against civilians must now stop.
Will you give way?
Just a moment. And that is why Labour is saying unequivocally that we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to end the bloodshed and the suffering.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. What I think is really important in this debate is that we try and come out of this with not only this House united, but with the United Kingdom in line with the international partners. What I would have said to the honourable gentleman from the SNP if he had given way was, well, the leader of the SNP in Prime Minister's questions was talking about being in line with the international community. Isn't it actually the case that it is the Labour amendment that will put us in line with those international partners, and in fact the SNP amendment that will put us outside of the space where the vast majority of the international community is?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. This is a moment when the whole House can come together. Let us be clear, whether it is the government benches, whether it is the opposition benches, all of us agree the time for a ceasefire has come. To end the bloodshed and suffering, to allow a sustained effort to salvage the hope of a two-state solution. There are 3 motions before us today. Only one of them can be supported by all sides.
We all want to see the fighting stopped. We can't begin to imagine the horrors of what will happen if Israel goes into Rafah. The problem is, I think we can all imagine that Israel might do just that and ignore international opinion. So can we start to think what action we will take, what sanctions we will take against Israel and propose if they do that. There have to be some consequences for Israel if they behave in this way, completely opposed to all international opinion.
Well, my friend knows that the UN is meeting to discuss these very issues, and I think all of us can agree in this chamber that were that to happen, particularly as is being indicated at the moment by the Israeli government over Ramadan, it would be a catastrophic mistake. Labour supports an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, a stop to fighting by both sides now, the release of hostages, a surge of aid into Gaza, and a two-state solution. I give way.
I hear what the honourable gentleman's saying about a humanitarian pause, but can I ask him how did he feel? Oh, a humanitarian ceasefire, and humanitarian effort in Gaza. But can I ask the right honourable gentleman how he felt when the leader of the opposition said very publicly that Israel had the right to withhold power and water from the people of Gaza?
He didn't say that.
137 days into this crisis, I say to the honourable gentleman, and I've now been in this House for almost 24 years, this is the moment to lift the tone, not lower it. Can I just turn, Mr. Speaker, to the SNP motion? Can I just turn to the SNP motion, if I may? It expresses our common desire for the fighting and suffering to stop. But it does not address, as currently drafted, although I did listen to the spokesperson for the SNP, it does not address how the fighting will not restart. It calls for an end to the war, but it does not lay out a path to a sustainable peace. It does not fully explain how a lasting ceasefire can be achieved, and it makes no mention of a two-state solution or Palestinian statehood. It does not reference the ICJ ruling and the need for its full implementation. Frankly, colleagues, the SNP motion appears, appears to be one-sided. For any ceasefire to work, it must, by necessity, be observed by all sides, or it isn't a ceasefire. That's why we are clear. Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence. Israelis have the right to the assurance that the horror of the 7th of October cannot happen again. I have no doubt that the SNP agree with these sentiments, because I heard that in the honourable gentleman's speech. He should then vote with the Labour motion.
I'm really listening to the right honourable gentleman closely. The problem this House has is that we don't have operational control over the combatants. And this war will end when both sides are exhausted and they decide they want it to end, and they lay down their arms. And I listened to the right honourable gentleman, spokesman for the SNP, and I just, at the end of the day, he read out a very long charge sheet against Israel. But Hamas is using its own people, men, women and children, as human shields. And it knows what it is doing as well.
Well, that is why we say to the right honourable gentleman, a ceasefire by necessity means both sides. It's very careful. The honourable members should be very careful not to vote for the appearance that this House is taking one side, however concerned we are about the innocent loss of life. I give way.
Thank you for giving way. He's talking about a permanent ceasefire, which clearly that's what we all want. We need peace in the region. But if he can't demand an immediate ceasefire, and that the immediate ceasefire must be permanent, because you can't guarantee. So surely If he wants it to be a permanent ceasefire, that allows the carnage to continue and Gaza to be wiped from the map.
Let me be clear. The Labour Party is calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We have been absolutely clear. When that ceasefire comes, we do not want to see the fighting restart. I've been crystal clear about that position. I will give way.
I'm very grateful for the honourable member for giving way, and I'm grateful for the position he is now adopting around an immediate ceasefire. And I think there is more cohesion in this House today than we're actually showing the public. There are still some people, though, in this House who are demanding that a ceasefire has to be permanent. Now, I don't like making the comparison to our own peace process, but the basic principles are the same. You cannot guarantee the permanence of a ceasefire. You work for a ceasefire and then you work to make it permanent. So the bar is too high for some people. If people want to listen to what the public are saying and watch the TV screens, people are dying today. We have to call for an immediate ceasefire right now, and I thank the member for taking that position. I encourage all members to support any opportunity to vote for an immediate ceasefire tonight.
The honourable gentleman reminds this House of the seriousness of the issue before us. He reminds us not just of the ceasefire, but the long yards and roads to peace. And that is why, in the Labour motion, we talk about compliance with the ICJ rulings and international law. We talk about Palestinian recognition on the road to that two-state solution, and we are absolutely clear that we should do nothing in this chamber that cuts across the hard work of Arab partners, EU partners, the United States, our Five Eyes allies, who are in the room trying to broker that peace. And we say that with some humbleness on the opposition side of this House, because neither of us are in the room. I give way to.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. Now, he's talking about how the SNP's motion doesn't have any plan for a long-lasting peace after an immediate ceasefire. But I therefore want to know why the Labour motion has included a caveat in it that notes that Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence. Hamas is not the people of Palestine. So why is that line in the Labour amendment?
The Honourable Lady is as educated as I am. She understands that a ceasefire takes two sides. So it's crystal clear that if we expect Israel to lay down their arms, we must ask Hamas to do the same.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and I'm very pleased to hear him making the point that any ceasefire has to be agreed and committed to by both sides. But unfortunately, there was a ceasefire on the 6th of October, and it was broken by Hamas. The previous ceasefire at the end of last year was broken by Hamas. Why does he have any faith that if a ceasefire was agreed now, Hamas would stick to it?
The honourable gentleman makes a good point, but let us be clear. The last pause that we saw came before there had been any release of any hostages. It came at a point where very little humanitarian aid was going in to Gaza. And it is because of that pause that we saw some hostages released. And Hamas did stop the rocket fire at that point. So as I say, we are all clear that we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The humanitarian situation self-evidently needs the fighting to stop. But it's our belief also that if we get that ceasefire, we would also see more hostages released. And we are also listening to what hostage families themselves are saying in Israel. Can if I may just make a little progress, I might just make a little, and then I'll come back to the honourable members. Can I next turn to the government amendment? Again, there are elements of it which we agree with, but there is a serious omission, and that's its failure to call for a ceasefire that is immediate. I don't believe, and I'm looking forward to listening to the right honourable member when he gets to his feet, but I don't believe that the gap is unbridgeable. The Foreign Secretary says he wants the fighting to stop now, mirroring the language of myself and the Leader of the Opposition. Throughout this war, the government have followed us. We called for the violence against West Bank settlers to be sanctioned on the 6th of November, and again on the 9th of November. The government moved on the 14th of December. For 2 years, since Boris Johnson's appalling letter, we've been calling for the government to accept the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction over the conduct of all parties in the occupied Palestinian territories. Again, the government moved on the 14th of December to do just that. For a decade, the Labour Party has supported the recognition of the Palestinian state as expressed in our motion. Earlier this month, the Foreign Secretary moved to our position. So once again, we ask the government to reflect on where the mood of this House is, and we ask members opposite to accept the language that we've moved today so that together we can speak with one voice. And I say that with all seriousness. All of us know that whilst we can debate these issues in this House, the effect of them on the ground are something else entirely. But if the UK Parliament, on this greatest of issues, can speak with one voice, then perhaps we can genuinely make a difference. Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank him very much for giving way, and I've been listening very carefully to the way he's been prosecuting the merits of each of the different amendments. I would point out there was a Liberal Democrat amendment which answered positively all of the points so far that have been made and was not selected, and I feel that's a shame. I will be encouraging my party to vote for all amendments that push the cause of peace, but I ask him, he mentions how this will be seen on the ground. The fact is, after today, it's likely, unfortunately, that the headline that comes from Parliament will be that a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, was rejected because of the lack of coordination between particularly the opposition benches. Would he agree with me? We should and could have done better.
Well, I have huge respect for the Honourable Lady, huge respect for the Honourable Lady, and she and I, since October the 7th, were together in Bahrain meeting with Middle East leaders talking about these very issues. The whole point, I would say, of the Labour amendment is to give this House the opportunity to come together. And her poignant messages to this House a few weeks ago are a reason why this is the moment to come together. I give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and of course I'm very pleased to be supporting an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the recognition of Palestine. When the desperately needed ceasefire does happen, does my honourable friend agree that the government needs to be doing everything they can to urgently ramp up the amount of aid that is going into Gaza to try and save more lives?
My right honourable friend raises the central point as to why we're calling for that immediate humanitarian ceasefire at this moment. We all know that before this crisis, about 500 trucks were getting in a day. Today, it's less than 95. Today, starvation is widespread. Today, medical aid is hard to come by. The last hospitals are closing. And personal to me, because one of my children is adopted, there are now 17,000 young people who are orphaned in Gaza. It's horrendous. And it's why the seriousness of this debate demands us all to act with one voice.
Grateful in my right honourable friend in giving way, and I agree with him. There needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. I agree with him. But that also needs to be in accordance with a clear political framework for a two-state solution. Otherwise, you will have the same problem, if I may ask the question. Otherwise, you may have the same problem a year or 6 months down the line. The question I ask him is this. People outside are fed up with politicians saying they want a two-state, and prime ministers and leaders of the opposition saying they want two-state, but not clarifying what two-state is. Looking at the Labour motion, does he now agree with me and other parliamentarians when we talk about a recognition of a viable Palestinian state? That would need to be in line with the United Kingdom's own drafted UN Security Council resolution 242 with regards to what a recognised Palestinian state needs to be, so people know and have a clear framework, because otherwise 67, 77, 87, 97, 2007 and now in 2024 we keep calling for it. Let's make it clear what that recognition state is and a clear timeline when we will recognise that state.
The honourable gentleman raises a very important point, and it's why in this motion we talk about that political solution that is necessary. All of us know that it is not military and weapons that will bring an end to this crisis. It's the business that we're all in. Political discussion and dialogue. That's what will bring an end to this crisis. And he talks about the circumstances for that two-state solution. Recognition in of itself does not achieve that two-state solution, but it's our commitment, if we can work with partners. We are on a road and a journey, and we have heard partners in other countries speaking to that issue at this point in time. Most colleagues, when they talk about those two states, are thinking about 1967 borders, but I hear what he says about the various members. I'm going to make some progress because many will want to get in this debate, and I don't want to dominate the whole debate. So let me just make some progress and I will return to SNP colleagues. Mr. Speaker, Labour's amendment reflects the common sense and the moral purpose of the British people. They see the endless killing of innocents and find it intolerable. We want it to stop now through an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Labour wants that immediate ceasefire, not tomorrow, not in another 100 days, but now. They see the prospect of an Israeli ground offensive in Rafah, and know it will only lead to more death and suffering. They want it to stop not tomorrow, not in 100 days, they want it to stop now. They see the families of hostages in agony, whose capture is prolonging their agony. They want to see the hostages released not tomorrow, not in 100 days, they want them released now. The common sense of the British people understands that rules exist for a reason, and that the international rule of law must be followed. They want Israel to comply with the ICJ's provisional measures, not tomorrow, not in 100 days, but now. And the common sense of the British people understands that no ceasefire can be one-sided. They know it's not enough just for Hamas or just for Israel to stop firing rockets. They want both sides to stop. Not tomorrow, not in another 100 days, but now. I give way. I give way to the formula.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and he makes the point that it's only going to be politics and diplomacy that can take us to that two-state solution. That underpins why it's necessary to have that ceasefire on both sides, the return of the hostages. But it's incumbent on all of us. We've debated that two-state solution for decades. This now has to be a wake-up call, and the international community coming together to insist that the rights of Israelis and Palestinians are now recognised. But to do that, to begin that process, we need this House today to vote for that ceasefire.
I agree with the right honourable gentleman, and I ask him to vote for the Labour amendment. I give way.
Grateful to the Shadow Minister, and on his point about a matter of days elapsing and no more days to elapse, the official opposition were here just 16 days ago with their own Opposition Day debate. They were discussing ministerial severance. Why, I wonder, can the Shadow Minister tell me that they didn't have the same priority for the people of Gaza as they had for ministerial severance just 16 days ago?
It's absolutely pathetic. It's beyond pathetic.
I have been calling for the fighting to stop for weeks. The leader of the opposition has been calling for the fighting to stop for weeks. I say to the honourable gentleman, I was in the West Bank. I was in Egypt. I was in Qatar. I was in UAE. I was in Saudi Arabia. That is how seriously we take this issue. I was also in Israel. None of us have more moral
Order! Order! Please. It's meant to be going through the chair and not David Lammy.
None of us, Mr. Speaker, have more moral authority than each of us acting to pass a motion and speak with one voice in this House today. The British people have seen the spectre of violence in Northern Ireland over many decades, and they understand that a ceasefire is not the final destination, but a step on the road to a lasting peace. One that requires hard negotiation, a roadmap for a political process. There's no way out of the crisis without hope that both Palestinians and Israelis have a path to security, to justice and opportunity in lands that they can call their own. Progress will require genuine partners for peace on both sides of the table. Hamas and Israeli hardliners want to bury a two-state solution, and we must now unite to show that we will not let that happen. And as I said before, my discussions with the United States, with European and Arab leaders in Munich, have made clear the widespread acknowledgement of the need to urgently seek that just and lasting solution: a sovereign and viable Palestinian state, a safe and secure Israel, which has strong, trusting relations with the countries in the region. That is the prize. I do not underestimate the great pain and division that must be overcome, nor the challenges ahead. The UK cannot advance this agenda on its own, but it can't also sit this one out. It is time for the international community to stand up, achieve an end to the fighting and a path to peace, and the UK must play its part. That's why our amendment makes it explicit that we will not give up on a two-state solution. It makes it clear that we will work with international partners to recognise a Palestinian state as a contribution to, rather than an outcome, to a two-state solution. Mr. Speaker, in this House, we are used to division because our trade is politics. But on this matter, we must rise above it. When the British people are so clear and are so concerned from Truro to Inverness, let no one tell us they take no interest in foreign affairs. Would it not send a powerful message if for once we could come together as a House for the sake of the nation, for the sake of peace? Mr. Speaker, in this spirit, we've designed our motion that my honourable friends to the left and to the right of me on the government benches across from me may vote for. It's my appeal to those in this House that we come together, calling in one voice to end the killing, for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire that calls on both sides to stop. A united Parliament today can show we're rolling up our sleeves, committing to the long, hard road to peace, so that we will have made the voice of our nation heard to influence this war, to help these tragic children of the same land to find peace in the beautiful Palestine of tomorrow, and an Israel without tears, where the stones of Jerusalem should finally be a city of peace. I beg that this House approves the Labour amendment.
Mr. Speaker, this has already been an extremely interesting debate. We heard from the right honourable gentleman, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I will give way later, but I'm not giving way for the moment. So, Mr. Speaker, he spoke about the huge benefit of us speaking with one voice. We heard, I think, the member for Foyle talk about the more cohesion in the House existing than people currently think. We heard from another member about the importance of there being some humility. I think it was the Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, because members of Parliament are not in the room. I emphasise the government is in the room, and there was a call that we should lift the tone today. He said, the Honourable Gentleman for Tottenham, he said we should come together. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that the right thing to do tonight is to support the government's motion. The opposition has been very supportive in the past. I think with the House speaking with both the opposition and the government with one voice, that was very helpful to Britain making the arguments that he and I both share in the Middle East. And Mr. Speaker, we will, if you advise us later, move our amendment. And I want to be sure that the House will consider this very seriously in the same tone that the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has said. And our amendment says that the House supports Israel's right to self-defence in compliance with international humanitarian law against the terror attacks perpetrated by Hamas, condemns the slaughter, abuse and gender-based violence perpetrated on the 7th of October 2023, further condemns the use of civilian areas by Hamas and others for terrorist operations, urges negotiations to agree an immediate humanitarian pause as the best way to stop the fighting and to get aid in and hostages out, supports moves towards a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, acknowledges that achieving this will require all hostages to be released, the formation of a new Palestinian government, Hamas to be unable to launch further attacks and no longer in charge in Gaza, and a credible pathway to a two-state solution which delivers peace, security and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians, expresses concern at the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and at the prospect of a military offensive in Rafah, reaffirms the urgent need to significantly scale up the flow of aid into Gaza, where too many innocent civilians have died, and calls on all parties to take immediate steps to stop the fighting and ensure unhindered humanitarian access. Now, Mr. Speaker, I submit to the House that that very carefully crafted amendment put to the House today ought to carry the vast number of right honourable and honourable members as the government seeks in this incredibly difficult situation to forge a common path and a common purpose to a change in what we're seeing today. I will give way, but I'm not giving way yet. I've returned this morning, Mr. Speaker, from Qatar as part of the British government's collective efforts to make progress on key objectives. I must apologise, Mr. Speaker, to you and the House that I will need to be absent for part of the debate. Now it extends to 7 o'clock as I'm engaged in other ministerial duties. Mr. Speaker, we all want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible, but we also recognise, or we need to recognise and understand, that a ceasefire will not last if hostages are still being held, if Hamas still rain down rockets on Israel, if they maintain control of Gaza with capabilities to carry out further terrorist atrocities. The immediate priority must be negotiating a humanitarian pause. And this is because it will create a window to get more hostages out safely, to get considerably more aid in quickly, and to get further negotiations on a sustainable ceasefire going immediately. We want the pause to become a complete ceasefire without, I say this to the honourable gentleman, without a return to fighting. This is the focus of our diplomatic efforts as we talk turns to a military offensive in Rafah. This has the potential for devastating consequences. I therefore welcome this opportunity to reflect to the House on the latest developments. As the Prime Minister said to Prime Minister Netanyahu last week, we continue to support Israel's right to defend its people against Hamas's terror. But we are deeply concerned about the loss of civilian life in Gaza and the worsening humanitarian crisis. I will in a moment, but let me also reflect on the terrible impact of this conflict. On October the 7th, Israel suffered the worst terror attack in its history at the hands of Hamas. Over 1,200 Israelis were reported killed. Over 5,000 Israelis were reported injured. Even now, over 130 hostages are still thought to be held by Hamas in Gaza. Last week saw the first hostage rescue since late October, with 2 hostages returned to their family. We continue, Mr. Speaker, to call for the immediate release of all hostages, including British nationals and their families. We are using all diplomatic channels to push for that, working with partners across the region. Meanwhile, we have helped more than 300 British nationals to leave Gaza. The devastating humanitarian crisis is worsening daily, with hunger and disease spreading. And according to the latest reports, more than 29,000 people have been killed and 69,000 injured. 1.7 million people have been displaced. We want to see Israel take greater care to limit its operations to military targets and avoid harming civilians and destroying homes. I give way to my right honourable friend.
On a particular point, I wrote to the Foreign Secretary on the 2nd of January and received a reply from one of his junior ministers in the House of Lords about the plight of the 650 Christians held in the Holy Family Church, who are basically innocent hostages of this appalling situation. And I asked the Minister, the Foreign Secretary, if we could give these people asylum. They're clearly in the crossfire here. I received, frankly, a disingenuous reply saying that the government would seek respite for these people. That means nothing. Are we prepared to offer asylum to these people and get them out?
Well, my right honourable friend will know this is a very difficult area which involves other departments in the government, but I will ensure that he gets an update on that issue from my right honourable friend when she winds up the debate. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. Now, he's just laid out the government's position. It may not be immediately clear to those watching the difference between that and the Labour amendment. The Labour amendment calls for an immediate ceasefire. His calls for a pause, which by definition means the war isn't over, but there's a pause in it. The Labour amendment calls for the introduction of a Palestinian state. The Labour amendment is in line with Australia, Canada and New Zealand, and the Labour amendment opposes the action in Rafah, whereas the government only has concern about it. So can he just explain on those 4 differences what it is he thinks is wrong with what Labour are saying in our amendment?
Grateful for his recognition that we are close in terms of the amendment which the government is putting and the amendment which the official opposition are putting. I think it is a great pity that it isn't possible for the official opposition to support the government amendments tonight, and I very much hope that he will consider that when he comes to decide how to vote. In respect of the other things he mentioned, I'm coming to them directly, if he will allow me to do so. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, we are deeply concerned about the prospect of a military offensive in Rafah, where over half of Gaza's population are sheltering, including more than 600,000 children. These are people who have fled repeatedly since the conflict began, and as the Foreign Secretary has said, it is impossible to see how you can fight a war among them. There is nowhere for them to go. They cannot go south into Egypt, and they cannot go north because many of their homes have been destroyed. Hamas, of course, displays the utmost cynicism in lurking among civilians, sacrificing innocent lives in the name of their fanaticism. We condemn this utterly. But we must also recognise the result of this cynicism. Israeli soldiers will only be able to reach hostages or the Hamas leadership at an incredible cost to innocent lives. We share Israel's desire to end the threat from Hamas and ensure it no longer exerts control over Gaza. But the UK and our partners say that Israel must reflect on whether such a military operation is wise. Is it counterproductive to their long-term interests? How best to achieve the goals the international community has set out before it takes any further action? Britain and our partners, Mr. Speaker, are doing all we can to help those suffering. We have trebled our assistance and we are pressing to get it into Gaza by all available routes: land, sea, air, trucks of aid rolling in from Jordan and ships loaded with supplies sailing from Cyprus, all while striving to get more crossings open. Last week I was, as I mentioned, to the House in Qatar, where we discussed the need to increase humanitarian aid to Gaza. I'm pleased to say a joint UK-Qatar aid consignment arrived in Rafah last week, including tents to shelter families in desperate need. Our partnership on that consignment prefigured our new $50 million global humanitarian and development co-funding initiative, which I unveiled with Qatari Minister Al-Qatar last weekend. The Rafah crossing, Mr. Speaker, is vital to ensure aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. Britain has continually underlined the need for Israel to ease restrictions on humanitarian supplies and ensure the UN and aid agencies can reach civilians in need throughout Gaza. Let me also reiterate, I will give way in a moment to the right honourable gentleman. Let me also reiterate that Israel must obey international humanitarian law in the way it prosecutes this war and in terms of ensuring that food, water and shelter is available to Gazans. It must also take all possible measures to ensure the safety of medical personnel and facilities. The British government has repeated this point in all our engagements with Israeli counterparts and partners, including during the Foreign Secretary's visit to Israel on the 24th of January, and with regional partners, including Saudi Arabia, Oman and Lebanon. I give way to the right honourable gentleman, the former leader of the Labour Party.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I'm grateful to him for that. He poured cold water on the South African submission to the International Court of Justice before it was placed. Could he now give a response from the government to the decisions, the interim decisions made by the International Court of Justice, the World Court, which effectively called for an immediate unilateral halt to the hostilities by Israel against the people of Gaza? Surely, if the government believes in the rule of international law, they should respect the International Court of Justice.
Well, I set out to the right honourable gentleman, I think, before in this House, that the government respects the International Court. We made it clear we thought it was a mistake for South Africa to launch that case when they did, and the view of the British government has not changed since I last told him that view. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, the most effective way now to alleviate this suffering is an immediate pause in fighting to get aid in and hostages out. This is the best route to make progress towards a future for Gaza freed from rule by Hamas. Britain has set out the vital elements to turn a pause into a sustainable ceasefire without a return to fighting, one of the key points that the honourable gentleman, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, made, and perhaps create the political space for a lasting peace. But we can only turn to this if there is first a break in the fighting. I give way to the honourable lady.
Very grateful for him giving way, and anything that advances this is good, and I welcome the government has moved. I'm afraid the fact that it's not immediate I can't support because I don't feel it captures the urgency. But I do want to welcome something the government has done, which is the sanctioning of the 4 extremist violent settlers, because there is a link between what is happening in the West Bank and the settlements, the political views of the ultra right-wing in Netanyahu's government, especially Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and the protestations of Netanyahu that he does not want a Palestinian state on 67 borders. He's been very clear about that. And when you put all that together, it in part explains why the assault in Rafah and the rest of Gaza is happening as it is. So would he tell the House a bit more about those sanctions, because they are working, but also what have they said to Netanyahu about a future Palestinian state, because it is a necessary precondition for any kind of truce, ceasefire, whatever we want to call it.
Well, I have great respect for the Honourable Lady, as she knows, but on her last point, she may rest assured that both the Foreign Secretary, who knows Prime Minister Netanyahu well, and the Prime Minister, specifically in a conversation last week, have been very clear on the importance of that. And I hope she will consider that tonight when she decides how she's going to vote on these various amendments. And I will give way to my...
As my right honourable friend said, and I think the opposition Shadow Secretary of State said, we are in the business of politics. So if my right honourable friend was to enter into negotiations this week with the Israeli government, do we have more chance of persuading it to an immediate ceasefire or more chance of persuading it to the cause of a humanitarian pause?
My right honourable friend makes his point extremely clearly. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend in giving way. Just looking at the specific wording on the government motion, where it says, and finding a credible pathway to a two-state solution which delivers peace. With regard to that specific point, and the point made earlier, where is the United Kingdom with regards to the recognition of a Palestinian state? I saw comments by the Foreign Secretary recently with regards to that. And for that two-state solution to be achieved, the government needs to set out what does it consider a Palestinian state to look like? Is it on the 67 borders on a motion that we, the United Kingdom, drafted and wrote and asked others to support? Because if we're looking at Ukraine around the world, people say if we want you to support us on international law, we have to be consistent in our approach.
Well, he'll appreciate that it's important not to go too fast and imperil the objective that we are making, but I am coming, I point out to him what I said to the Honourable Lady, but I am coming very directly to that point. We have set out, I will give way in a minute, I think I've given way quite generous, I will give way in a minute. We have set out the vital steps for achieving the pause we wish to see. All hostages must be released and the new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza formed, accompanied by an international support package. Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel must be removed and they must no longer be in charge in Gaza. Finally, there must be a political horizon, to which the Honourable Lady and my honourable friend appeared, which provides a credible and irreversible pathway to a two-state solution. The resolution put forward in the Security Council yesterday did not achieve these outcomes. Simply calling for a ceasefire, as that resolution did, will not make it happen. Indeed, as it could endanger the hostage negotiations, it could actually make a ceasefire less likely. The way to stop the fighting, Mr. Speaker, and potentially stop it from then restarting, is to begin with a pause to get hostages out and aid in. That is what we are calling for, and it could end the fighting now. We have also taken further steps to hold those to account who undermine the steps to peace in the West Bank. Last week, the British government announced new sanctions against 4 extremist Israeli settlers who have violently attacked Palestinians in the West Bank. Our long-standing position has been that we will recognise a Palestinian state at a time that is most conducive to the peace process, and I submit to the House that must be the right answer. We must give the people of the West Bank and Gaza the political perspective of a credible route to a Palestinian state and a new future. And it needs to be irreversible. Likewise, we must give the people of Israel certainty of security. This does not just come down to us, but we can help. Crucially, we've made clear the formal recognition of a Palestinian state cannot come at the start of the process, but it does not have to be the very end of the process either. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
My perseverance, I do appreciate that. I think this has been a very highly charged debate, both in the House and in the general public, and people are rightly angry. Now, part of the anger is born from a real sense of frustration that this Parliament, this government, doesn't give the same value of life to a Palestinian child as it does to an Israeli child. And that, whether we accept it or not, that is a strongly held belief. Now, we know with Rafah there are 600,000 children who are at risk if that ground offensive begins. No ifs, no buts. Will he say from the dispatch box the government do not support that action?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, I set the government's position out extremely clearly, and I recognise the point that he is making, that there are very strong feelings across the House on this matter. The point I am trying to make in this speech today, made by a number of other members, is that there is an awful lot in the government's motion which most people in the House can agree with and can support. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Grateful to my right honourable friend. He said that the Foreign Secretary has asked Israel to think again about any further military offensive or incursion into Rafah, and I think we all would urge Israel to think very carefully about how that would be conducted. But would he agree with me that our support for Israel on October the 7th was clear? We said that it should be able to eradicate Hamas. And there is a very real danger that our emerging position, and certainly that of other parties, will leave Hamas's terrorist organisation partially intact. That is an intolerable situation for Israel. It sends a very clear message that using human shields works, and that we will not allow Israel to fully defend itself. How would he answer that question?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, I have answered it because I have made clear the government's position in respect of Hamas and Hamas's future. And I think if he reads the record and he reads the motion tonight with care, I think he will see that the key point that he is making is one that informs the government's view. I give way to...
Thank you. Does my right honourable friend have any discussions with the Israeli government that if the hostages are released by Hamas, then Israel will withdraw and the peace process can then start going forward?
I'm sure the House will understand, Mr. Speaker, that I cannot comment in any detail at all on the hostage negotiations that are going on. But what I can tell my honourable friend and the House is that Britain is right at the front of trying to make sure that these negotiations are successful. Mr. Speaker, let me end by recognising that there will be a huge amount to do in the days after a pause. It will be a starting point on the road to peace, not the final destination. Nevertheless, it is critical that all parties give this process the best odds of succeeding. That means first securing a pause in the fighting which then progresses to a sustainable ceasefire and, we all hope, a lasting peace. I urge all members of the House to look carefully at the government motion tonight before deciding how to vote if you, Mr. Speaker, put it to a vote.
The original question was as on the order paper, since when the amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment now be made. Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to begin with something that Frankie Boyle actually said. And he pointed out that it makes no sense to say that the situation in Gaza is too complex for a ceasefire, because ceasefire is one of the oldest and simplest terms to understand. It means stop firing. In fact, it's so simple that it's actually designed to be heard and understood in the middle of a literal battle. So there is no middle ground when it comes to a ceasefire. You either follow the order or you don't. You either stop firing or you don't. Now, during the 2014 crisis, there was an estimated 2,251 Palestinian deaths. The then Prime Minister rightly called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. But if we fast forward 10 years to the current conflict, we have a death toll of nearly 30,000. And that's not including the bodies that have yet to be recovered from underneath the rubble. And yet the very same man, now Foreign Secretary, is failing to support a ceasefire. And that number, nearly 70,000 people have also been injured. So according to Amnesty International, the death rate in Gaza right now is 1 death every 4 minutes. It won't just be bombs that are killing Palestinians, it's poor sanitation and malnutrition as well now. We know that people are starving, people being reduced to eating grass and animal feed. In January last month, over half of all aid deliveries were denied access and could not get through to those who currently need it. Less than half of hospitals in Gaza are even partially functioning, and the few that are will quickly run out of supplies unless Israel allows aid through. Now, since 2008, Israel have refused entry to any UN agency individuals, which to me is a giant red flag in and of itself. But despite these attempts to shield themselves and hide from any accountability, we know that war crimes are being committed in Gaza. Churches sheltering hundreds of innocent Palestinians being bombed to the ground. There's been strikes against people in refugee camps and hospitals. Just earlier this week, there was reports that Israeli forces ordered the evacuation of a hospital only to start sniper fire on those who attempted to leave, leaving 2,500 folks still trapped in the hospital. Israel's own Minister of Defence said that there would be, and I quote, a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. Now, as the occupying power, Israel has an obligation under international law to ensure the basic needs of Gaza's civilian population are met. They are not doing that. Now, the International Court of Justice specifically directed Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. They are not doing that. Yet Israel still refuses to reinstate the water supply they so cruelly shut off months ago. They're stopping medicine getting in, they're stopping food entering Gaza, and despite the growing likelihood of famine that they will have created, they still are not budging. Now, the actions of Hamas, let's be absolutely clear, they were horrific and unjustifiable. But as I said earlier to the Shadow Minister, the people of Palestine are not Hamas. Israel's disproportionate and indiscriminate bombing of civilians, combined with everything else that we know, has got to be the very definition of collective punishment, which, as we all know, is illegal under international law. It's a war crime. And this is why it's so important how this place responds. Because in many respects, the ending of the violence in Gaza rests in the hands of the countries supplying the money and the weapons to Israel. Now, the Arms Trade Treaty bans the sale of weapons where there is a concern that they may be used to breach international law. Well, given the International Court of Justice has found that there's a plausible risk that Israel is committing genocide, it is upon the UK to revoke all arms licences and military equipment to Israel. Otherwise, we break the own treaties that we've signed up to. Frankly, warm words and platitudes will not cut it. Only action will. Now, that's one death every 4 minutes. And the time that this debate happens today, and we all talk amongst ourselves, 100 more people will be dead that were alive this morning. The least we can do is call for a ceasefire. Because if we don't, we will be morally and directly complicit in every single life lost and every single family destroyed in Gaza. The route to peace, the route to justice, the route to any humane conclusion to this begins with an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, because anything less from us and future generations will quite rightly never forgive us or forget.
Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Whatever anyone's views about the history or the politics of the Middle East, no one can be in any doubt that since October the 7th, we have all witnessed a humanitarian tragedy. The attacks of the terrorist group Hamas, including the murder of young people attending a music festival and the taking of hostages, was bound to set in train a series of violence that Hamas themselves must have fully understood, including a full response by the Israeli government. In completely associating myself with the comments of my right honourable friend on the government's motion, particularly the need to have an immediate humanitarian pause but a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, including the release of hostages, I wanted to take up a point that was made by the Right Honourable Member for Ross Guy and Lochaber, who's no longer in his place, about the role that Britain can have in the more substantive issue around the conflict. As has been pointed out in this debate, we are not participants in the conflict, therefore we cannot have a direct effect on whether arms are laid down or not, but we can have an influence in the process that comes later. Sooner or later, this will have to return to a political process, and Britain should be now setting down the rules by which we want to see peace, not at the moment, to see peace put in place. And I think it's highly important that we understand what we actually mean when the term peace is being used in this context. And I know the honourable member for Oxford West, who I had the privilege to be at the Manama Dialogue with, feels very strongly about this too. And we have to make clear that on both sides, and constantly applied to both sides, the concept of peace is not just the absence of war or conflict, but the freedom from the fear of conflict or oppression or terror. And peace requires mutual respect, freedom from persecution, and living without fear of destitution. It comes with self-determination and liberation from arbitrary justice. It needs hope and dignity and enforceable rights. And only when all the people of the region have access to all of these could we talk about having achieved a peaceful solution to the conflict. Now, I think that we need to look at that political process with two addenda. The first is that when we move to a two-state solution, and we must move to a two-state solution, because the people who don't want a two-state solution are Iran, which doesn't want Israel to exist, and apparently Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want a Palestinian state to exist, but we must recognise the will of the international community that there must be a two-state solution in the end. But for a political process to be able to exist, we need to deal with the wider security issues. There needs to be a guarantee of the security of Israel from the sort of attacks it has seen. And it's very clear that the Israeli construct of security has failed. Otherwise, the Hamas incursions would not have taken place. It's also very clear that there has to be a proper guarantee of security for any emerging Palestinian state. These quite self-evidently cannot be done by the states on their own. And just as we looked for international guarantees of security for Europe after World War II, so we will need to have international agreement around any security architecture within which a political solution can be found to the Israel-Palestinian issue. And the other thing I would say is this, that we need also, as a country, it's something that I'm sure this House can unite around, we've got to make sure that it's a wider concern about the improved prosperity, hope and opportunity of all young people in the region. Now, it's been my privilege to lead the UK's Abraham Accords group over the past 2 years, and I welcome support we've had across the House. But we have got to find mechanisms of improving the economic well-being, particularly of young people on the Arab street. Otherwise, there will be no lasting basis for a political solution. People who have got nothing to lose will gamble with it. People who have got something to lose will be much more circumspect. That has been the lesson from, I have to say, that the governments of Bahrain, the UAE and Morocco have been far-sighted to maintain that process during the current conflict. But if we don't take that path, we run the risk of going back to 1971 and a generation of radicalised young Arabs who will make a political solution impossible. And we need now to recognise that this debate that we're having today, much of which is, I have to say, quite nuanced on the terms of when and how ceasefires are actually taking place. But we need, as a country, to be setting our sights and our horizons further on what happens when the political process does re-engage. Where does Britain play a role in that? I believe that we have a very positive and constructive role to play. And I think that we now need to take our debate onto that wider and much more important and far-sighted horizon.
Order. There are some 60 members. There are some 60 members wishing to take part in the debate. even given the time available and allowing half an hour for the wind-up speeches, not each, that's 10 minutes for each of 3. We've got to put a time limit on. I'm going to start now, immediately, with a time limit of 5 minutes. That is very likely to drop down to 3 in fairly short order. Lena Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am speechless with the way this debate began, actually. As this House knows, there has been scant opportunity for me to be able to tell the story, not just of my family or the hundreds in the church that they are in northern Gaza, but the story of Palestinians on the ground and indeed those who have lost people in the horrendous attacks on October the 7th, whether it be their murder or their abduction. And so I'm grateful that we've got this opportunity. And as we've got hours of debate in front of us, my first ask of anyone who comes after me is to please hold all those people in their hearts as they say what they say. I believe sincerely that this House is moving towards a right position, and I'll explain what I think that is in a moment. But to suggest that this House is in some way against a ceasefire, and I would hope an immediate one, however semantics wants to play out in the votes later, can we please try and send a message to the Palestinian people perishing in their tens of thousands on the ground in particular, and to those hostage families, that fundamentally we need this to stop now. Yes. And I don't care what we call it. I should have started by drawing the House to my register of interests. I sit as an unpaid advisor on the board of the International Centre for Justice for Palestinians, but last week I went to Israel and Palestine with Yahad. And I'll start with a story. On the first day, we went down to the southern border with Gaza. We went to a place called Nativ Hazara, a place I'd visited before, where we met with an incredible woman called Ronnie, who had lost family members. 16, in fact, from that kibbutzim had perished. And as you go there, you can look across at Gaza, you can look across at northern Gaza, and I saw the plumes of smoke. I heard the drones, the pop, pop, pop of the gunfire, and I broke down. And as I walked back through the village, Ronnie, a peace activist, Israeli, took me to one side, gave me a hug, said, "I'm so sorry," which I said back, and we both cried and held each other. It's important to remember that while those voices of peace in Israel have been silent for some time, that many of those people who were killed on that day were allies of the Palestinian people, who had been calling for decades against the occupation, who had been calling out Netanyahu's government, who had condemned Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And it's for that reason that I'm welcoming of the sanctions on those extremist settlers, because there is a direct link between the right-wing elements of Netanyahu's government and those extremist settlers. And you'll notice in the Lib Dem motion, we shouldn't finish there. We need to continue those sanctions on those people and their connected entities. But as I looked across, thinking of my family still there in that church in northern Gaza, with no food, with no water, with no way of getting down to the south, even if they could cross at Rafah with the 1.5 million people who are there, without an immediate ceasefire, they and other families who are trapped can't achieve anything. And that's even before we think of if they left, if they'd be allowed to come back, or if they left, would there be a political solution? That horizon, that political horizon, is everything. Without it, without a two-state solution on 67 borders, we are condemning both Israelis and Palestinians to reliving this nightmare over and over and over again. And I would ask, if there's one message that we are sending Netanyahu and Hamas today, is that we will not accept that.
Tobias Elwood.
Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome this debate on supporting a ceasefire in Gaza and the steps required to get us there. But let me be clear, as the nation, and indeed beyond, watches on, it's been a very sad day for Parliament indeed. Rather than offer clarity on Parliament's position, speaking with one voice as we seek to end the fighting, there are not one, but three separate motions as this debate turns into political football. Shame on us for failing to find common ground. What a wasted opportunity to exhibit UK leadership and resolve in seeking to get closer to the very objective that we came here to debate. It is a reflection, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on how fragmented and polarised our world has become, that no single power or alliance of states, or indeed international organisation like the United Nations, is in control of events that are now unfolding in the Middle East. With all its troubled history, a region on the junctions not just of three continents, but of three great Abrahamic religions. From the start, I supported Israel's right to defend itself after those terrible 7th of October attacks. But I was the only voice here in Parliament when we reconvened to warn Prime Minister Netanyahu, before he sent in the tanks, not to invade until there was clear governance and security plan for which any military operation can work towards. And that still eludes us today. Now, away from Netanyahu's leadership, Israel is an important UK ally, a rare democratic state in a troubled part of the world. It deserves our support, but also our frankness. The scale of the collateral damage is shocking. Indeed, that phrase seems inappropriate given the loss of life. But there is nothing simple about urban warfare. Future military strategists at Sandhurst and West Point are likely to use the Israeli military invasion as an example of how not to do it, of how tactics without strategy fails. Yet on the other side, we look at examples in the Middle East to condemn Hamas, but they are not there. Bahrain was the only country to say they condemn what Hamas did. Are we expecting the Palestinian Authority to then step in? Because they're having their own problems in their own neck of the woods. And as I've said before the Israeli tanks rolled in, I was the only one to suggest a temporary technical council be formed by those who signed the Abrahamic Accords to take responsibility once those guns fell silent. But there's no mention of any of this in any of the motions that have been put forward today. So are we suggesting that we empower Hamas to stay, as they remain committed to destroying Israel? It's in their covenant to do exactly that. So shouting ceasefire, ceasefire, alone, unconditionally, I'm afraid will not change anything. And I say this as somebody who's been involved in a few as a soldier. Perhaps it's symbolic. Surely with our statecraft and our influence and our convening power, we should be doing so much more. A ceasefire is a contract agreed between two sides. It involves a third party to step forward to make sure that they can control what goes on. It begins with a cessation of hostilities that allows space for other activities to take place and allow plans to advance. Neither Israel or Hamas are in that place yet. The alternative is a larger third force mobilized to enforce a ceasefire. I suspect nobody here today is advocating that. It calls for, in a ceasefire, timeframes, no-fly zones, buffer zones, emergency procedures to quash any breaches, agreed incentives about hostage release, for example, humanitarian support, and, of course, international monitoring teams which a UK could play a part. But I don't see any of this being discussed today, apart from the clarion call, let's have a ceasefire. This is the detail, I'm afraid, that you need to discuss before you demand one from afar, which perhaps makes ourselves feel better. I simply make the case. From here, it is easy to shout those words, let's have a ceasefire. It's harder to implement it in practice. But Britain has a role to play, an important, persuasive and active role to play on the international stage. What we've done today is illustrate how much more we need to learn, how we need to elevate our calibration of debate in order to deal with these international matters. I'll be supporting the government today, but I recommend that all three parties get together so we can come back to the House and agree a unified statement on taking this forward and how a ceasefire might proceed.
Order. A number of members have indicated... Order, please. A number of members have indicated a desire to withdraw, but I still think we're going to be playing beat the clock, so I'm going to drop the time limit now to 4 minutes. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and good afternoon. Mr Deputy Speaker, much has been said of the deaths and suffering of civilians in Gaza, and I add my condemnation of those responsible on both sides in this conflict. In the brief time allowed today, I wish to highlight briefly the role of risk taken by three specific groups of people which receive little media coverage. These are the humanitarian aid workers, health workers and journalists. We all owe them a great debt of gratitude for the work that they carry out in the most dangerous circumstances in areas of extreme conflict and suffering, with the ever-present risk of death, serious injury and disease. Mr Deputy Speaker, since the 7th of October, at least 136 staff members of the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Organisation have been killed in Gaza. The International Agency's Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said recently that throughout the United Nations history, they had never witnessed the deaths of their staff in such large numbers. Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to health workers, at least 300 health workers have been killed during this conflict. The killing of aid workers and health workers is both unacceptable and illegal. The World Medical Association has made this clear repeatedly, and in 2002 said, "The right to health is a fundamental element of human rights, which does not change in situations of conflict and violence. Access to medical assistance for the sick and wounded, whether they have been engaged in active combat or not, is guaranteed through various international agreements, including those of the Geneva Convention and the United Nations. Israel and those nations supporting her, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have signed up to these agreements, and the neglect to enforce them is criminal." Mr Deputy Speaker, journalists too have paid a heavy price to bring us reports of events on the ground. At least 126 journalists have been killed in Gaza since October the 7th, with many others being arrested. The presence of journalists in Gaza is essential in order that the world be kept informed of the horrific events which are taking place, and in due course to hold those responsible to account. Mr Deputy Speaker, the United States and the United Kingdom has much more work to do in this respect of challenging all participants in this conflict and to respect the human rights of civilians, including humanitarian aid workers, health workers and journalists. Without these humanitarian aid and health workers, many more lives would be lost, and without the work of the journalists, the world would be far less well informed of the horrors that are taking place in Gaza. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the last week, 27 humanitarian and human rights agencies, including Christian Aid UK, Oxfam, Muslim Aid, wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, a suspension of all arms exports, and for the UK to ensure Israel fully implements international courts of justice orders. In conclusion, any continuation of the military operation in Gaza merely results in innocent men, women and children paying the price for a crime they did not commit. The only way to prevent further loss of civilian lives is to secure release of hostages, and the entry of life-saving humanitarian is to secure an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including calling off the Rafah offensive. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, today. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I fully support international demands for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and will be voting in favour of the SNP motion today.
Villiers. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I know that every single one of us in this House, in this chamber, wants the fighting to stop and the conflict to come to an end. Loss of civilian life is always a tragedy, no matter what the justification for the military intervention which leads to it. So yes, our government must use all diplomatic means possible to try to secure another humanitarian pause in the fighting, to get hostages out and more aid supplies in. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, demanding an immediate ceasefire, I'm afraid, amounts to asking Israel to unilaterally lay down its arms, while its hostages remain in peril and while Hamas retains power in Gaza. Hamas official Ghazi Hamad has said that they would repeat the 7th of October attack, quote, again and again. He said, October 7th, October 10th, October 1 million, everything we do is justified. That is shocking, Mr Deputy Speaker, and unless Hamas is defeated militarily and removed from power in Gaza, there is nothing to stop it rebuilding its capacity to commit heinous acts of terrorism. Now, I appreciate that people who call for an immediate unconditional ceasefire are sincere and well-intentioned, but I do feel that such call means abandoning support for Israel during their time of greatest need, when they are exercising their right of self-defence. And we must not forget the 7th of October attacks, in which 1,000 people lost their lives, involved sickening levels of violence and abuse, murder and mutilation, the killing of babies, children and the elderly, decapitation and rape and sexual abuse of the most horrific kind possible. When I visited Israel in January on a trip recorded in my register of interests, I had the chance to speak directly to people who are suffering the torture of knowing that their loved ones remain in the hands of this violent Islamist death cult. We must not forget the hostages still held in Gaza, who may well be being raped or tortured right now. No pause or ceasefire can be workable, sustainable or permanent unless it comes after the release of all hostages, after defeat and removal of Hamas from power, and after an end to the terror group's capacity to repeat their 7th of October atrocity. And that is why I will be voting for the government's motion this evening.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Yeah. A bit sooner than I expected, Mr Deputy Speaker, but thank you. Interestingly enough, Mr Deputy Speaker, I rose in the House on Monday and quoted a former member of the House, indeed a former member for Dundee and a former Prime Minister, and the same proposition I would lay before the Prime Minister if they were here, and indeed the leader of the British Labour Party, regarding what I think is their delayed response to this cataclysmic genocide being rained upon the Palestinian people. Their British policy to Palestine has indeed, in that quote, been weighed in a balance and found wanting. How else can our constituents, indeed the people of Scotland, view the British Parliament when its political class has, since November, the last time we dragged it to debate this subject, actually view them as they have deflected the reality on the ground in Gaza? Now, since November, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to know at the end of this debate, when the Minister sums up, what assurances did the Prime Minister, and indeed any other ministers or shadow ministers from the loyal opposition, receive from the government of Benjamin Netanyahu regarding the systematic targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure? Has there, I have to say, seemed pious interventions in any way restrained the government of Israel from the policy of genocide, all the while enabling the death cult? And I have to agree with the Right Honourable Lady across who just spoke, the death cult of Hamas, indeed making it a partner in death, hate and crime. How does this British political class find itself in this devilish and ominous situation? Now, 153 nations have concluded that the immediate ceasefire is necessary to bring an end to the utter devastation in Gaza and seek a way forward to deal with that death cult of Hamas, which is supported by, as we know, the theocrats of Iran. And I must remind the House it was a regime to which the British government has pledged to pay £400 million to in regards to an outstanding debt. So it is complicated. But the Chamber needs to discuss this as I see the government pirouetting on the head of a pin. For how is it that the French Republic has called for an immediate ceasefire? How is it that NATO allies like the Kingdom of Spain and also the Kingdom of the Netherlands have not only called for a ceasefire, but have even stopped sending arms to Israel? How have they come to conclude that which this Parliament and its political class cannot? 153 nations, Mr Deputy Speaker, with the British political class led by the British Prime Minister and the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. One asks, opposition to what? Now, I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the State of Israel has been acting, the way it has been acting must be challenged. We cannot sidestep the issues faced by the Palestinian nation. I think I've spoken to one of the speakers from the Liberal Democrats. Its survival, and indeed the State of Israel's survival, depends on it. This is a generational injustice that the Palestinian people have endured. And what is the answer? I know the answer. It's an immediate ceasefire. The Prime Minister of Israel's strategy is to actually isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And let's remind ourselves, he is a Prime Minister who's already tarnished not only with a wicked policy in Gaza, but mired in allegations of corruption. And his cabinet's a minister who is a convicted terrorist and another minister who is a confessed fascist. We must be mindful, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in seeking peace we require justice, and that peace, as others have said, must be founded in truth, built according to justice, vivified and integrated by charity, and put into practice in freedom. I'm sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, freedom desired by Palestinians and Israelis alike.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I say to any Jewish people listening to this debate anywhere in the world at the outset that you do have friends and allies here in this chamber. And the SNP motion today calling for a unilateral ceasefire by Israel woefully fails to recognise the reality. And I'm sorry to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, they're not interested, the SNP, in a solution that would both safeguard the civilians of Gaza and enable an Israeli victory over Hamas, because if they were so motivated, they would be putting pressure, for example, on Egypt to open the Rafah crossing as a refuge instead of massively strengthening it. But of course, the focus is all on Israel defending itself, and Israel has been through multiple rounds of conflict initiated by the genocidal Hamas terror group in Gaza, and this motion, should it achieve its objectives, would cement the prospects of many more such incursions or attacks in the future. And that is, of course, exactly what Hamas wants, to secure endless opportunities to destroy Israel, granted by the confused logic of that motion. And if the terror group is left standing, they will regroup. They say as much. This isn't conjecture. They make this clear in interviews. And they will continue their onslaught, and it must not be permitted to continue as a terror statelet. And I regret to inform the House that the political grandstanding that we have seen in some quarters, not in all quarters, it will not make an iota of difference. Hamas has no intention of laying down its arms. And Israel, as a fellow democracy, has a responsibility. I won't give away just yet. It has a responsibility. And I was, I have to say, shocked last night to hear the leader of the SNP accuse Israel of committing war crimes and hear the bandying about of such phrases. This incendiary charge is not borne out by the legality of the situation, and it is not in accordance with the facts. It's worth noting that the ICJ in its interim ruling said Israel has a legitimate right to continue its campaign against Hamas. And let us not forget, Mr Deputy Speaker, that all Hamas needs to do is to release the hostages, including very small children, and hostilities would cease immediately. And let's not forget the third wave, which were the thousands of Gazan civilians who crossed into Israel at the October 7th attacks, and why civilians have been able to sell some hostages. So Israel has taken these steps, despite being under no international legal obligation, for example, to provide
electricity and water to the people of Gaza, it has done so, despite the grave security threats posed by Hamas. And of course, Hamas cynically destroyed those very same power lines and water pipes on the 7th of October, which Israel swiftly repaired. So the honourable member for Aberdeen South, I also noticed, said that condemning Hamas's attack is omitted in the SNP's motion because it goes without saying. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the moment in this country and in many other countries around the world, it doesn't go without saying. Considering there are several thousand anti-Semitic incidents that have been recorded in the United Kingdom, including in Scotland, since the 7th of October, and that people were celebrating in jubilation the deaths of 1,000 people outside the Israeli embassy in London before the IDF moved in on the 7th and 8th of October. So it doesn't go without saying a responsible government in any jurisdiction is one that uses every opportunity to stand with the victims of heinous terrorist attacks.
Adam Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Northampton North began his contribution by telling Jewish people watching that they have friends in this chamber. I wish to reiterate that in the strongest possible of terms. Jewish people are not the Israeli government and Muslims are not Hamas. In a matter of weeks, Muslims across the world will fast from sunrise to sunset during the holy month of Ramadan. It's time to take life at a slower pace. That, however, is far from the reality for people in Gaza. They live with hospitals bombed, homes bombed, ambulances bombed, churches bombed, mosques bombed, UN schools bombed, refugee camps bombed, factories bombed, and the bombing continues. Gaza is under siege from the air, and the F-35 stealth bomber, often referred to as the most lethal fighter jet in the world, is being used. Parts for this fighter jet, the laser targeting system and the weapons release system, are made in British factories, which means that we simply do not know if those weapons are being used by Israeli authorities in the massacre of families and children in Gaza. Politics is all about choices. The UK government has the choice to stop or suspend arms export licences to Israel, and there's precedent for this. In 2014, the current Foreign Secretary, who was the then Prime Minister, suspended 12 arms export licences in light of evidence of human rights abuse. It is morally corrupt, outrageous and sickens me to my core that the UK continues to sell arms to Israel. To the people of Gaza, the mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, to you all, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this institution of Westminster has seen your tears, yet ignored your pain and suffering. I'm sorry that your hopes of returning to the beach to play in the clear blue sea have been snatched away from you. I'm sorry that children are experiencing heart attacks and will live a life full of trauma. I'm sorry that your dreams and aspirations have changed from becoming scientists and footballers to dreams and aspirations of staying alive and accessing clean drinking water. I'm sorry. In their hundreds of thousands, the public have marched on the streets, a unified mass movement standing up against the status quo. People from different and no faith, men and women, adults and children, rich and poor, saying enough is enough, demanding a ceasefire. Here in Westminster, we may have the whip system and direction from party leadership, but every politician is accountable for their own actions. It does not matter that this debate was tabled by the SNP, who have third-party status. It doesn't matter if this vote isn't binding. These are semantics. We cannot continue to accept the systemic and deliberate oppression of the Palestinian people. There must be an immediate ceasefire. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful. In terms of the semantics, would you agree that we must remind ourselves of the quote from Benjamin Netanyahu in 2019 when he stated, when it comes to Hamas, for example, he knows that as long as Hamas remains in Gaza, he can always argue there is no partner for peace during our lifetime. He's part of the cause of this situation.
I completely agree with my honourable friend and I thank him for his intervention. Britain, of course, has a moral responsibility towards the wider Middle East region for the scars of the British Empire, the Iraq War and the incompetence of successive governments which have promised peace yet failed to deliver. When we look back to this period of history, we'll surely be asked, and we'll ask ourselves, what did you do when Gaza was being relentlessly bombed? Yet here we are in the House of Commons with members of Parliament playing time-wasting games and abandoning international law. Why?
Stephen Crabb.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the backdrop to today's debate is two things, I believe. One is the appalling outpouring of anti-Semitism in this country, which we debated in this chamber on Monday afternoon. I think the other part of the backdrop for today's difficult debate is what I believe is a concerted campaign to pressure and even bully MPs to fall into line behind a very specific wording about ceasefire, which implies an unconditional ceasefire, and it has an objective of keeping Hamas in place in Gaza. Now, every right-thinking person in this chamber this afternoon wants to see an end to the fighting, an end to the bloodshed. It's an appalling loss of life. We can be united on that. And I was in southern Israel last week. I went to one of the sites of the worst parts of the massacre that took place on October the 7th. I met with Palestinians as well when I was in Jerusalem last week. And everybody in that region is feeling the pain of this. Families are bleeding physically and they're bleeding emotionally and mentally. At this time last week, I was sat with a group of mothers of children, people still in their late teens, who are being held by Hamas in Gaza. And these mothers and fathers are worried sick about what their daughters are currently going through. Now, no amount of wishful thinking and us passing a simple motion this afternoon that calls for an immediate permanent ceasefire is going to make that happen. The very difficult practical negotiations and discussions going on involving Egypt, Israel, America, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Do we honestly think that this messy, divided debate that we're having this afternoon is going to make any difference to the kind of discussions that they are having right now about how we dial down the violence, open up space for aid to go in and get some kind of negotiation going that will see the release of hostages? I happen to believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, that if there's one single thing that would change the course of the war right now and lead to an end to the violence that we're seeing, and that would be the immediate release of the hostages. And actually, if there was one thing that we could unite around this afternoon, it would be a simple one-line motion that calls on Hamas to release those hostages immediately. That point should be made time and time again. Now, my problem with the SNP motion that's on the order paper, there's several issues I have with it. First of all, no mention of the use of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war against Israeli women. And why is that important? It's because there is a campaign at the moment, not just on social media. I see it in the emails coming in from constituents. I had a constituent confront me with this last Friday that seeks to deny that these atrocities happened. They're saying that somehow Israel has concocted this. These crimes didn't take place. Well, they did take place. They were recorded on mobile phones and body cams, and they were picked up in other security cameras, and there's a 47-minute film that people can watch if they make themselves available to do that. Hamas fighters having the time of their life, committing most barbaric acts, and I would encourage all members to grip themselves and watch that film. My other problem with the SNP motion this afternoon is that there is no mention of Hamas's guilt. The fact that they started this round of conflict. The SNP spokesman started his speech by saying he condemns Hamas's atrocities. Well, why didn't the SNP motion say that? Why doesn't the SNP motion spell that out? And I'll say this, Mr Deputy Speaker, my problem fundamentally with the SNP motion is that at the heart of it, it lets Hamas off the hook for what happened on October the 7th, and I'm not going to give way to the honourable gentleman.
Before I call Carol Monaghan, after her, the next speaker, which will be Sir Edward Lee, will be down to 3 minutes. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The recent ICJ ruling means that the UK, as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, is legally obliged to take measures in the face of Israel's failure to prevent acts which may be found to amount to a genocide. I've been contacted by many constituents on this issue, asking for me to support a ceasefire. But I want to read you the email of one constituent. She contacted me and I spoke to her yesterday by phone, but I'll read you her email. I'm writing to you again as a Jewish constituent, urging you to join your fellow MPs in calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. I, like many in my community, have been utterly shaken by these months of violence. As I write, over 28,000 Palestinians have been killed, 12,000 of them children, and over 1.9 million displaced. Jews in the UK have been in a collective state of shock and distress since the atrocities committed by Hamas on October the 7th. Many in my community lost family and friends in the attack. Yet this only strengthens my resolve to end the utterly heartbreaking violence Israel is unleashing against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. This is not a war. I pray for the safety of both Palestinians in Gaza and the hostages in captivity. But only a ceasefire can provide the relief they desperately need. Lives, livelihoods and families are being destroyed. The very fabric of Palestinian society in Gaza is being upended. Such a policy of revenge and collective punishment achieves safety for nobody. The UK government is responsible for ensuring international law is adhered to. Yet every moment it fails to advance a ceasefire, it is complicit in the perpetration of war crimes and the killing of civilians. The ongoing escalation of violence in Rafah risks further mass atrocities. This cannot go on. As a Jewish constituent, I thank you. I thank the First Minister and the SNP for your actions so far in working towards a ceasefire, the return of the surviving hostages and a lasting peace. I urge you, my MP and my government, to demand an immediate ceasefire, the safe return of hostages and the urgent provision of substantial life-saving aid to Palestinians in Gaza. This is quite simply the only way we can end this violence and start to fight for a future that guarantees freedom, equality and dignity for all Palestinians and Israelis.
3-minute limit. Sir Edward Lee.
I've just been talking to a lady colleague who received a green card to go and speak to people in Westminster Hall. The moment she explained the government's position and her support of it and this moderate amendment put forward by the government, she was surrounded by a screaming mob, videoing her and intimidating her. All this hatred has got to stop. We've got to pull together in this country. Nobody in this country, nobody in this House was responsible for the horrific attacks by Hamas. We all utterly condemn Hamas and its genocidal activities. We must support moderates, both in Israel. There are many moderate people in Israel who do want a two-state solution, who are horrified by the activities of settlers trying to intimidate Palestinians. We must give hope to Palestinian people. Nothing can justify the genocide on October the 7th, but still there is this degree of hopelessness amongst the Palestinian people at the rate of settlements in the West Bank and what is happening in Gaza. We must give them hope. So that is one side of the story, and surely we can unite behind that, and I support the efforts of the British government in trying to do so. But surely we can also take a moderate and sensible position on this issue of the ceasefire. There is no point in having a unilateral ceasefire now if you are faced with a death cult who will use that ceasefire to go on bombing and killing innocent Israelis. It will achieve nothing. We have to have a balanced, sustainable ceasefire in which the hostages are released the Hamas leadership is removed permanently from Gaza. Now I'm speaking on behalf of the people who live in Gaza. There's no future for the Palestinian people living in Gaza with Hamas in control.
Yep.
There will be constant warfare, constant hatred, constant disaster, constant bombing. We've got to get rid of Hamas. We've got to get the Palestinian Authority, for all its faults, back in control, and we have to push the peace process forward. The government amendment is moderate, sensible, it's trying to achieve peace, and we should support it.
Well done. Chris Law.
Mr Deputy Speaker, late last night I returned from Cairo as one of the members of the International Development Select Committee to listen to the experience of heads of NGOs and UN agencies who have been working in Gaza. They described a man-made humanitarian catastrophe, and I'm ashamed of the moral cowardice from those in the world in the response in failing to firstly prevent and secondly stop this atrocity unfolding before their eyes. I heard first-hand Gaza is characterised by death and destruction. Bombs and bullets have claimed the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people. Whole families have been wiped out, whole cities have been left uninhabitable. Those who have survived have been horrifically injured and left displaced and nowhere to go. Nothing is off limits with the Israeli forces who have been targeting places of worship, schools and hospitals that are destroyed. Disease, malnutrition and starvation become inevitable. In these conditions, Mr Deputy Speaker, for so many, hope has been extinguished. Time and again, some of the most experienced humanitarian workers, people have borne witness to the worst disasters in the world and conflicts, told me they've never experienced anything like the horrors of Gaza. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are only 150 aid trucks per day getting into Gaza. The UK is saying it's supplying aid, but it's sitting in trucks at the border. And even so, destroyed infrastructure, the lack of security due to the constant threat of Israeli bombardment, and the huge numbers of people contained in such a small area means there's an inability to distribute aid once it gets there. The message from aid workers is clear. An immediate ceasefire must be implemented to stop the slaughter and to deliver life-saving aid to the trapped people of Gaza. How anyone in this chamber could vote against this basic notion of humanity is beyond me and my constituents. Mr Deputy Speaker, where else in the world has there been a war where the majority of people killed are women and children, where they have been hemmed in with no escape and killed, like one witness said to me, like fish in a barrel? Andrew Gilmore, former UN Secretary-General for Human Rights, told Newsnight just last night that the killing of women and children, and I quote, was probably the highest kill rate of any military killing anybody since the Rwandan genocide of 1994. In Cairo is told of ambulances and field hospitals being targeted, of people with white flags being shot on the spot, of children as young as 5 being pronounced dead with a single sniper shot to the head. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is not a proportionate response. This is collective punishment, pure and simple, and it's a breach of international humanitarian law. Who here honestly believes that this immense suffering is part of a just war? Mr Deputy Speaker, I have listened to Prime Ministers and the Leader of the Opposition in this chamber rightly call for justice for Russian war crimes and in Ukraine, despite there being no judicial judgment. Conversely, I voted in recognition of the genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, despite the UK Government refusing to recognise this, as they say it can only be determined by a court. Yet when the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent genocide, as there is a plausible risk, the UK Government has stated that Israel's actions cannot be described as a genocide and has not publicly called on Israel to comply with its ruling. Mr Deputy Speaker,
we have to leave it there. Raymond Shishti.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the opportunity for parliamentarians to have their say with regards to how we find an end to this horrific conflict that has cost so many thousands of innocent lives, both Israeli and Palestinians. And I recall coming to this House in October when the Prime Minister was making a statement for the first time. And I said what we saw on the 7th of October was horrific terrorist acts committed by Hamas. That was a horrific terrorist act. They took the lives of innocent people, and that is unacceptable. But since then, when we have this debate today, and in the backdrop of this debate, we are seeing the terrible loss of innocent lives. And we look at the House of Commons library document with regards to the numbers of innocent people who've lost their lives. So 29,000 Palestinians have lost their lives. 69,000 Palestinians plus have been injured. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, 1,200 innocent Israelis were killed. 5,431 Israelis have been injured, and 88 journalists have been killed. And I wrote to the Prime Minister on the 1st of November calling for humanitarian pauses, which would get aid in and hostages out. Absolutely, all hostages have to be released. That was on the 1st of November, calling for that. We're now looking at February, and since then we've not been able to achieve the objective of peace and release of those hostages. And in that regard, the first point would be confidence-building measures for 4 days, for 8 hours, 8 days, then release of hostages. Hasn't happened. So the question that I have today for me, with that position having been taken, what is my position today? I will be voting for motions which call for immediate humanitarian ceasefire, or which call for immediate ceasefire, because the time has come. If not now, then when? And the United Kingdom is a member of the Security Council. And the Prime Minister said at Mansion House, the United Kingdom will lead and not be led. And if that is the case, we need the United Kingdom to stand up. Yes, I give way.
I thank my honourable member for giving way. Prime Minister Netanyahu has confirmed restrictions will be imposed against Palestinian Muslims wishing to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam, during Ramadan. As per international law, Israel has no sovereignty over East Jerusalem or over Al-Aqsa. So does my honourable member agree that this is a deliberate provocation of Palestinians, and will he join me in condemning this dangerous and discriminatory move?
I think what I say to my honourable friend, he asked that question to the former United Kingdom Special Envoy for International Religious Freedom. All places of worship must be protected. And previously, when we saw about 3.5 years ago, Al-Aqsa Mosque stormed on the night of Laylatul Qadr, was absolutely unacceptable. And we are now coming into the period, not just of Ramadan, we're coming into the period of Easter, we're coming into the period of Passover. That's why the point I made to him earlier, with regards to if not now, then when. Of course I accept we need hard-edged diplomacy to deliver on a two-state solution. Immediate ceasefire, release of hostages, with regards to immediate humanitarian assistance going into Gaza. The UK can, and I wrote to the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister, have an international donors conference for Palestine. We did it for Friends of Syria. Therefore, we're looking at creative ways to move forward, to save all innocent lives. And yes, the UK needs to put its position, firmly out there with regards to what we see as a two-state solution and a Palestinian state. And that has to be in line with the 1967 borders and our position at the UN 242. Do you know what? We drafted that resolution, and therefore we need to make sure we deliver on that. So yes, today is the time to ensure we deliver a ceasefire and lasting peace in the region.
John Nicholson.
How to find words in my allotted 3 minutes, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the tragedy which has engulfed the Palestinian people. Israeli bombs have killed 30,000, more than 10,000 children have died. The death toll per head of population is greater than any conflict since the Second World War. Gaza lies in ruins. People are starving. Women are enduring caesareans without anaesthetics. And yet this House has been paralysed. I vividly remember as a journalist in Palestinian refugee camps, Palestinians would come up to show me the keys to lost homes. Their families were forced to flee in what is now Israel, where advancing guerrilla troops spread terror. And they would also, along with their old-fashioned keys, show me British Palestine mandate house deeds issued by us, guaranteed by the United Kingdom and stamped with the mark of the Crown. We owe them. At the very least, we owe them our voices raised in outrage at the collective punishment they are now enduring in defiance of international law. Innocent people, children, babies, not remotely responsible for the atrocities carried out by evil Hamas. Slaughtering indiscriminately the innocent for the crimes of the guilty, that's the very definition of collective punishment. So what's the point, some say, We know we can't force Netanyahu to stop bombing, but the point is that we can apply pressure. Silence is tacit acceptance of Israel's actions. We can show Palestinians who still imagine that this House is a moral compass that we do care passionately about their plight. We lament their suffering, and we despair at the lost innocence of their children as another generation learns to associate Israel with cruelty, extremism and hate. Now, the vote at Westminster tonight, the second we on these benches have called, is not and never was, as some commentators parochially claimed, about embarrassing political opponents. Not everything is about Britain. Now, I won't speak for my colleagues cross-party, though I know many out with the SNP support our motion. Some have lost their front-bench jobs because they can't in good conscience remain silent. I hope the majority of Westminster MPs now feel the same. Embarrassed silence will not save lives. If we don't call for an immediate ceasefire now, when will we call for an immediate ceasefire? How many more innocents have to die? No. It's past time for our voices to be heard loudly and unambiguously. Enough bombing, enough slaughter.
Kit Malthouse.
Speaker, I too was on the cross-party emotional visit with Yakad to Israel and Palestine last week, where we stood at the site of mass murder in Kibbutz Be'eri and in Nativ Hazara and heard with horror the accounts of the victims and bereaved relatives of what happened there, but also stood on a bluff above Gaza City and saw the artillery landing and heard the gunfire and the drones overhead and contemplated the futility of 30,000 dead and with horror thought of the assault upon Rafah and its 600,000 children. Various things became clearer during the visit, Mr Deputy Speaker. The first is that there can be no military victory over Hamas. That is widely accepted across the world and is being whispered even in Israel, not least because every bomb and every bullet that lands is a recruiting sergeant for that appalling organisation. The second thing that became clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the security of these two peoples are intrinsically intertwined. Anybody who is interested in the security of Israel in the future has to recognise that this conflict is making things worse, not better, and that the security of the Palestinians is required for the security of Israel into the future. We also, Mr Deputy Speaker, met some remarkable people. Rachel Goldberg, whose son Hirsch is still being held by Hamas. Mao Zinon and Yonatan Zaygin, whose parents were both killed by Hamas. A group of young Palestinians who yearn for freedom, all of them dedicating their lives to peace. They were the threads of hope that we met on our visit. And they offered the prospect that these two remarkable peoples could find a way to live side by side. And then I returned to the United Kingdom, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to find us trapped in a crazy battle of semantics. I do not, I have to say, confess, understand the difference between a ceasefire, a pause, a cessation, a truce, qualified by sustainable, credible, whatever it is, humanitarian, one that lasts. The British people think our moral compass is spinning in this House, that we have no clue what we're doing anymore, and yet they see the bodies of shredded children coming across the media pretty much every day. They want three simple things. They want the killing to stop of Palestinians and Israelis. They want the hostages to be returned, and they want aid to flow into Gaza. And our job in this House, as backbenchers, is to vote for the outcome we want to see, not some clever process by which we might get there, or second-guess what the parties are going to do, but to say now what we want to happen. And I agree with the British people that the violence must stop. If those people who hold out the prospect of hope in Israel to stand a chance, it has to be in an atmosphere of peace. It was Menachem Begin who said that war is avoidable, but peace is inevitable. It is time for the bloodshed to stop and for the talking to begin. And in this House and in this country, we must do what we can to make that so.
Thank you very much. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We sometimes rattle off statistics in this place and they have no real meaning. But what we do know is that in this dreadful conflict, there are 1,200 innocent Israelis that were brutally and evilly murdered, beheaded, raped, kidnapped on the 7th of October. And the consequence of that has been the unfolding of utterly horrific images across the Gaza Strip, with almost 30,000 people, men, women, children, innocent citizens, also tragically killed in this brutal conflict. I will be voting for an immediate ceasefire tonight because the fighting needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. But I will be doing so on the basis of the motion amendment that was set out so eloquently by my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Because words matter. And it matters that we call for a ceasefire, not a unilateral ceasefire, but a ceasefire of both sides. Otherwise, it's not a ceasefire. And they can laugh. But if Hamas do not lay down their arms too, it is not a ceasefire. Those are simple facts. I want to make sure that the offensive on Rafah does not happen, that we get aid into the Gaza Strip in the quantities that we want to see. Aid wasn't mentioned in the SNP motion. That the ICJ provisional rulings are implemented and upheld because international law matters. That we get a two-state solution and a peace process. That we tackle the wrongdoings in the West Bank. The illegal settlements have to end. But we also need to make sure that there is justice for the Palestinians and we get that Palestinian state. None of that was in the SNP motion. Now, I will give way.
There's no water or oxygen in the SNP motion. Does he presume, therefore, they don't want water or oxygen? Don't be so silly, man. You know exactly what this is about. This is about stopping the killing now.
Yeah, we know exactly what it's about, and he's playing party political football. He's playing party political football with the most atrocious situation that's going on in the Middle East. As the honourable member for Foyle rightly said earlier, there is a lot more that brings people together in this place. We want to see a ceasefire. We want to see an end to the killing.
Point of order. I'm playing party politics. I'm running a political party. He should know that.
That's not a point of order for the Chair. That's part of the argument.
You can still play political football, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We need that Palestinian state. We need to get justice and an end to this conflict that has lasted for 7 decades. The brutal reality and the real tragedy is, as has been said on all sides of the House, there is a lot of consensus, but it has been the extremes of this debate that the voices have been the loudest, and that is true in Israel and Palestine as well. It is a simple fact that the moderate voices on both sides have been drowned out now for 2 decades. Those that believe in a two-state solution have been left at the edges, and both the Netanyahu government and his allies and Hamas have both thrived on each other's extremism and have needed each other's extremism. Enough is enough. Let peace prevail, and let's have a ceasefire now.
Steve Double.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. I don't think there's anyone in this House, or in fact anywhere else, that doesn't want to see a ceasefire in Gaza. I'm sure we've all been deeply moved and concerned by the horrific sights we've seen of the suffering of the people in Gaza. And no one wants to see an escalation. And I would add my voice to those saying to Israel, think very, very carefully before escalating your action